Good morning. Thanks, Trevor, and welcome everybody to the second ever Rare Disease Access Initiative Symposium. We're very excited to have you all on board with us today to follow this journey throughout the day. And this is following our first event from August 2021 last year. So this is our second ever one. So the Rare Disease Access Initiative is essentially a consortium of interested people, groups and stakeholders that are really wanting to ensure equitable access for people affected with rare diseases in South Africa to healthcare, to generally improve the quality of life. And it really brings together a wide variety of stakeholders, including industry, funders, as well as a number of advocacy groups as well. And we're really excited to actually look at our agenda for today. We've got a really good lineup of speakers today. Our program has changed slightly since initiative, but we've managed to get some other great people to fill in the gaps. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Kelly du Plessis, who many of you will already know, who is the CEO and founder of Rare Diseases South Africa. You will probably know that Rare Diseases South Africa was born out of necessity when her oldest child was diagnosed with Pompe disease. And it was an astounding discovery to find out that there was no treatment for this rare neuromuscular disorder, which was fatal without treatment. And this is where Kelly's personal journey really started in South Africa. And she turned out to be so good at it that she got further involved in helping the plight of others impacted by rare diseases in the country. So Kelly serves on various boards and committees and is involved in presenting international conferences around the world, as well as within South Africa, really focused on raising awareness and to develop a new narrative related to the treatment and access options for rare disease patients. And to date, the lives of 6,500 patients and families impacted by these conditions in South Africa have been helped through Rare Diseases South Africa. And Kelly keeps ensuring that the patient's voice is never forgotten. So I'd like to hand over to Kelly now, who is going to talk about how and why we need to move forward with rare diseases in South Africa and what those steps and challenges are. Thank you, Kelly.
So thanks very, very much, Helen, and a warm welcome to everyone for joining us this morning. It's unfortunate that I'm not in any way or shape or form trying to fill Dr. Nicholas Crisp's shoes, but he was unable to attend this morning due to obviously responsibilities at the National Department. And as a result, I was asked to provide a presentation. So I'm going to just really be giving a short and concise update about really where we are and what we've been up to the last couple of years, not only from a Rare Diseases South Africa perspective, but I think largely from a Rare Disease Access Initiative perspective as well. So for those who might be new to attending this sort of meeting, might be new to the landscape, the Rare Disease Access Initiative is really it's a collective group of stakeholders that has come together to try really further support and endorse getting improved access for rare disease patients in the country. And this is a multi-stakeholder grouping. It consists of a variety of different stakeholders, including the likes of Council for Medical Schemes, medical insurance, medical aids, medical administrators. We do have pharmaceutical companies and industry represented. We do have the patient voice. It's a really, really open and inclusive grouping of individuals. And we've been doing this work, I think that this is probably the fourth year, maybe even going into the fifth, since we as a collective decided that we really wanted to work together towards addressing some of the issues that are persistent in South Africa. And, what can we do to really try move South Africa forward in terms of many of the challenges that a rare disease patient would face. And I'm going to just briefly highlight some of those issues. Now, this slide that you will see is ours as Rare Diseases South Africa. And these are challenges that I have obviously spoken about in various other meetings. But we'll see we've got a couple of obvious issues and then obviously some of them not as obvious. The one being that we have a dual healthcare system. And the result of that is that we've got patients there's a vast difference in terms of access between the two sectors. So what's available in the private sector is often very, very different to what's available in the state sector. And we also see a massive issue around referral systems, delay in diagnosis, etc., particularly in state facilities, because of the lack of awareness, the lack of resources in those areas, and obviously the large geographical coverage that they need to cover. So that dual healthcare system really, really presents a massive problem. One such issue that is, I think, probably the most problematic issue with this dual healthcare system is that you've got a disparity in terms of payers. So in the private system, you've either got very, very limited, but there are some cash, obviously cash payers. And then you also have the medical schemes who are obviously then reimbursing members. And then in the state sector, you obviously have government expenditure in the form of provincial departments, and that comes through from a hospital budget perspective. So what essentially happens is that a patient that can walk into a hospital that's 15 kilometers from another, those two hospitals might have very, very different service offerings. And patients are then limited to what is available in their particular hospital. And for us, obviously, as a patient advocacy group, this does not reflect what we'd like to see from a country perspective. We'd like patients to have some form of certainty in what they can expect being diagnosed with a rare condition that already has so many multifaceted issues just from the diagnosis alone and the fact that it is rare. So we'd really, really like to see some form of solution being put in place here. And one of the proposed solutions that has always been bounced around is an idea of a risk equalization fund. And that is essentially where both public and private would put into the same pool, and all the patients would be treated from that particular pool of funds, regardless of where they are accessing services. It would stop a lot of the issues around patients who are diagnosed in the state setting, then having to move across to a medical scheme to be able to receive a reimbursement. It would also stop people having to move between schemes. So it would essentially give you some sort of a surety that regardless of where you were diagnosed, that you would ultimately receive some form of benefit and some form of treatment for your condition, regardless if you were in state or private. So that's one critical issue. And obviously with the premise of NHI, it is something that we might see it being resolved to some extent, but that is obviously, it's up for discussion, and I think will probably crop up today in some of the discussions. Then we have the second issue is the lack of knowledge and awareness. And that is really around the fact that rare diseases are uncommon. They, from a public awareness perspective, very, very often people don't identify with patients who are diagnosed with a rare condition, what their challenges are, understanding disability in the workplace, understanding them from a schooling perspective. So there's those social issues. Plus, then you've obviously got the issues from a clinical perspective, where very, very often the knowledge is not necessarily sufficient. And because of the fact that the awareness is so low, patients have a long diagnostic journey that can often take in excess of years in terms of getting a diagnosis. So the solution there is obviously to increase the knowledge base, make sure that we make the necessary platforms available. We're obviously doing a lot of work in terms of trying to engage with the medical training institutes, getting as much contact time with med students in studies, so that we have sensitized them to the fact that rare disease patients do actually exist, and that they will probably see them in clinical practice, and to always kind of just keep them fresh and top of mind. Then we have the issue around lack of data, and this obviously has a knock-on effect across the board. So the first thing is when in an environment where you have a variety of different public priorities and competing priorities from a healthcare perspective, for us to be able to justify that we need a piece of the pie, essentially we need to show that the numbers are there. And unfortunately, because of the lack of data that we have available and the lack of surveillance, particularly with regards to rare diseases, it creates a massive issue in terms of us actually, the first question that gets asked is, you're telling us that there's all these patients, where are they? And we don't necessarily have an answer. So the solution to that is obviously improved surveillance. We do know for a fact, it has been confirmed by the department, that they are not monitoring and they are not surveilling rare diseases from a diagnostic perspective. So they are actually not keeping track. So we, as Rare Diseases South Africa, have designed a patient-led registry that it can be utilized across the board. It will also serve a clinical function as well, but it has not been designed to be a technical registry as generally these things would, be designed to be. We have taken on a very, very, very different approach in terms of how we've set that registry up, specifically to make it user-friendly and to remove the reliance on the success of that registry coming from the clinicians and the hospitals where these patients are, because we have seen that is a massive gap. Unfortunately, there's no dedicated services in those facilities to handle the surveillance of this nature, and as a result, these registries fail or they're underutilized. So we're hoping that by being able to bring the patient to be the person that registers on the registry as a starting point, and thereafter have that information validated by their clinician, we're hoping that it improves the uptake and the use of these registries. And obviously, as a result, hopefully, as time goes by, we will start getting a lot more data together. Then we did not have a local definition, but we have developed a draft definition that has been included in this policy framework that was circulated last year as a result of the symposium, and that has been widely adopted. And that reference is 1 in 2000. So that at least gives us some form of an indication of what is got to be included in the box. However, I want to reiterate, and it is circulated in the document as well, that we don't want to see a position where that definition is used as a means to exclude. We are acknowledging that it is a guideline and accepting that all cases need to be considered individually. If you take into consideration something like sickle cell disease, in the South African context, sickle cell would be considered a rare condition. Fly up to the likes of Kenya, etc., sickle cell is relatively commonplace. So this is the issue with rare diseases, obviously dependent on where you are, your geographical location, the ethnicity, the gene pool within that particular country. These things are very, very flexible. But in terms of policy development, it was absolutely essential that we had developed some form of a definition, because that ultimately explains what we are, the cohort of people that we are looking to provide services for. And then often we don't have an orphan drug policy in South Africa. Now that is different to an orphan disease or rare disease policy, in the sense that an orphan drug policy is very, very specific around drug development, research around drug development, registration around drug development, etc. And that generally includes things like escalation processes, I want to say incentivized registration, things that encourage people to obviously do the research and to develop drugs for these niche conditions. And that is something that South Africa still does not have, and that we are obviously hoping to work towards getting. And all of these challenges obviously then accumulate and result in limited access. And what we are trying to do here, obviously, as the Rare Disease Access Initiative, is improve that access and really, take these solutions, try drive them forward, and hopefully result in a South Africa where patients have some form of certainty. So my next slide is referencing the theory of change that we have developed as South Africa, well, as Rare Diseases South Africa. And this really just highlights what our thinking has always been in terms of developing this method that we've been using in all this time. So obviously data collection, fundraising, and the problem assessment has always been a critical starting point. So we have done quite a bit of work in that results, in that regard. We have managed to get a problem assessment, and I think that the draft framework that was circulated last year really, really does highlight some of the issues that we identified in that problem assessment. We do have a landscape, we have mapped the landscape, and we've understood what policies exist and what we could leverage and where the gaps are. And then now we've had to move over to these things in terms of partnerships and alliances and coalition and network building. So coalition and network building is our internal work that we do as RDSA. It is working with the support groups that are members of Rare Diseases South Africa. It's working with our community in terms of making the necessary adjustments, assisting them, getting the public awareness in place, etc. So that's relatively internal. The partnerships and alliance is an external development, and this is essentially The Rare Disease Access Initiative is one such example of the partnerships and alliance that we've created. And both sections need to have messages developed for them. The partnerships and alliances section, which is what we're focusing on today, will ultimately go on to educate policymakers and the internal coalition network and build, the coalition development that goes on to help with public awareness. And the interim outcomes that we would like to see as a result of that are things like, from a policymaker and education perspective, it's that change political will. And that is absolutely necessary. Without that, if we don't have political willingness, policies, go to die. So that's the reality. We need that political willingness. With regards to the public awareness, we need change public perception and change public willingness. The reason for that is without that public perception in place, government doesn't get held accountable. So you need the public to be on board with the concept, what it is that you essentially are trying to do, because that ultimately is what holds government accountable, ensures that the policies are actually implemented and that they are carried out in the way that they should be. And you need champions in terms of both of those sections. And then obviously the outcomes would be policy adoption and policy implementation. And hopefully at the end of the day, you sit where you're sitting with improved service systems and access. So what are the persistent challenges that we still have available to us at the moment? We still have access to new treatments. This is still a persistent challenge. There's a variety of reasons for this. One, there's a lack of research. So research is not necessarily readily available. It's very, very different to find patients, holding clinical trials, etc. Very, very difficult landscape. As a result, new treatments, whilst it has got much better, and I think many companies have a rare disease pipeline, obviously it's, we would like to see these sort of treatments becoming available a lot quicker, given that only 5% of rare disease patients have an access to a commercial drug at this point. Then we still see issues with regards to slow registration times. We obviously have issues around pricing and affordability, and then often availability as well. So being in South Africa sometimes serves as a negative in the sense that the companies that manufacture some of these drugs are very, very niche companies. They don't have a presence in South Africa. And as a result, you're only able to access these products as a Section 21, and that has its own issues in terms of reimbursement. We still have an issue around awareness, both clinically and in the sense of the public eye. I think clinically we are doing a lot better. I think rare diseases are a little less intimidating, if I can say that, from a clinician's perspective now, because I think clinicians have realized that there is help available to them to assist with the variety of different challenges that come up with treating a rare disease patient, and that they're not on their own in that regard. From a public perspective, there is still tons of work to be done. Then from a diagnostics point of view, we still have, there's a gap when it comes to understanding our local research, understanding the genes that we're finding here. We have lots of novel variants that come out of our studies, understanding the interpretation. We have still quite a relatively high cost in terms of performing these diagnostic tests. And then obviously we have capacity constraints, and that's why local investment is so necessary. And I'm pretty sure that Chris Forster will be giving us a little bit more insight into that a little bit later. Then we still obviously have the competing priorities. So we have national health insurance. I think anybody who's inquired about anything related to healthcare of late, or any changing in legislation, and even something like the PMB review process, we always hear it'll come out with NHI. But the reality is that these need to be done as a parallel process. We still have issues that need to be addressed today for patients that are, on the ground at the moment. We can't be saying, just wait for NHI to come along. So that's still, whilst it's an opportunity to some extent, it still is a problem in the sense that there is this kind of this notion that, okay, we'll address it with NHI. And then obviously we're still competing with the NCDs. Ironically, rare diseases should be included in that, but it seems that we're still somewhat on the outskirts. And we understand that South Africa has a massive burden in terms of things like HIV and TB. So that will always be a persistent challenge. we continue to have regulatory challenges from a variety of different perspectives. Council for Medical Schemes, as an example, as a regulator, there still continues to be massive delays when it comes to adjudicating any complaints that come through there in the dispute resolution process. The PMB review process is all but stalled. We have issues around Council for Medical Schemes mandate and their inability to effectively carry out their, they can create the laws, so to speak. They can create the regulatory environment, but they don't necessarily have the teeth to be able to mandate it and actually, carry it through. And I think that poses a big problem. With regards to SAHPRA, we still have lots of issues around things like the required testing that is necessary, which drives up the cost, particularly in biologics. The registration process, the slow registration times, Section 21 delays that often crop up, and also things with regards to compassionate usage and Section 36 packs and the exemption that's required for that. So that also takes up a ton of time, and generally it causes a massive delay and frustration in terms of a patient actually being able to access their treatment. And then we still have issues around alternative reimbursement models. There still seems to be a bit of a disconnect with regards to the legalities. I think there's lots of groupings working on these issues. We seem to think that legally it is possible. It's about determining who's actually going to own that from the department's perspective. And we certainly need a willingness from the Department of Health's perspective in terms of understanding that, ARMs are 100% necessary in terms of trying to unlock access, particularly for innovative products where pricing is such an issue. And certainly, I think that this is going to be one of the sticking points that we need to really focus on unlocking going forward, because of the fact that it poses such a challenge. And it seems like there are simple solutions in place. We just actually need to get that willingness from the department. And then obviously in terms of just general political willingness and policy delays, and that is a really slow process in terms of getting those things across the board. So what are our recent successes? So we've had relatively good engagement with SAHPRA around some of the issues, and we're actually going to be hosting a specific meeting with a variety of stakeholders with SAHPRA around some of the issues that we find are challenging. The same goes with Council for Medical Schemes. I think Council for Medical Schemes, it's been a bit of a tough year from a stakeholder perspective. I've had to openly criticize a lot of the delays that we see at Council. However, I think we've had really good discussions. We are in the process of putting a memorandum of understanding in place. And I think we can both agree that there are certain long-term goals that both of us need to work towards addressing for us to be able to see some relief in terms of the issues that we experience, but also for Council to be better capacitated. And then we've had some issues around the PMB legalities, obviously massive frustration with the fact that the PMB review process kind of stood to, ground to a halt and hasn't actually been reviewed like is necessary. But we've been relatively lucky in the sense that we've managed to have some good engagements around that as well. And we've also been able to test a few theories in the court setting as well, which has worked out really well. And actual fact, I saw this morning a new Supreme Court of Appeal judgment was issued around PMBs and using your medical savings as an opportunity. It's actually been ruled against now, and that it will be a binding ruling, obviously, because it's gone right up. It went through the whole Council for Medical Schemes process, and it has now actually been challenged both at the High Court and now at the Supreme Court of Appeal, that it is not possible to use patients' medical savings balance at all to fund any element of PMBs. There was this notion previously that you could use the medical savings right up until that had been exhausted, and then only PMBs would kick in, but that has now been overturned. So there seems to be PMB legality seems to be challenged quite a bit, and that process is robust and alive and well, I think, at the moment. And then we've also had really good levels of engagement across the board. We've been invited to many congresses. We are addressing, signing MOUs with key stakeholders. There's certainly been a willingness to address these issues around access and rare diseases and access to innovation, etc. So that's been good. We've had some good media visibility this year. We've had a lot of discussions around rare diseases and the context and the need for change within the sector. And then lastly, we had a very, very successful Dear Minister of Health campaign. It came across initially as criticism. We had to openly criticize many of the issues that we feel are falling short. But this campaign aims to be a lines of continuous engagement with the minister directly around the issues that are experiencing, patients experience on the ground. And we are really, really looking forward to being able to use that platform in a way that, unlocks this access and gets us across the line. So that's all from me. And I really am looking forward to everybody's discussions today. And I hope that we can use this as a good opportunity for engagement. So thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelly. I think that's a really good foundation for the rest of the program today, really looking at what are the key issues, including the barriers to making the environment more favorable in South Africa for those that are impacted by rare diseases. And just to pick up on your last point with all the criticisms, I think the one thing that I've learned to understand about rare diseases South Africa is that, yes, we will call out and we will criticize, but then we come alongside and want to partner with those other stakeholders that are involved to help find a solution together. We're not just going to criticize and call you out. And I think that really is a character, it really explains the character of this coalition group of our Rare Diseases Access Initiative, and the willingness to engage and work together has been quite outstanding over the limited time I've been involved, but as I understand throughout the 4 years that it's been going. So in case you don't know and you've just joined us a little bit late, I'm Dr. Helen Malherbe and I head up research and epidemiology at Rare Diseases South Africa, and I'm your chair for today. We are running a little bit behind. If you do have questions or comments, please drop them in the chat or write your questions in the Q&A, and we will endeavor, or the speaker will endeavor to respond live. You can alternatively put your hand up at the end. If there is time, we can take questions then, or we will forward that and make a note of it ahead for our discussion section later on the program. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who's going to speak from the medical schemes perspective, Dr. Nolu Nematswarani. And Nolu is the head of the Center for Clinical Excellence at Discovery within the Strategic Risk Management Division. She's a medical doctor with more than 20 years experience in healthcare, and she's an overachiever because she holds not one but two master's degrees, one in clinical pharmacology and another one in biostatistics and clinical epidemiology. Her current role at Discovery Health, within that role, she oversees health technology assessments, health economics, surgical risk management, and many other areas. And her unit is also responsible for the overall clinical strategy for Discovery Health and related businesses. So over to you, Nolu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you so much. And really thanks for this opportunity to actually share on behalf of the schemes. So without wasting any more time, let me just get on with it. So from a medical schemes point of view, when we speak about rare diseases, as you can see, there are question marks. When we think about definition, we do not define, we do not really identify rare diseases. We manage them, in the day-to-day of managing claims and managing member benefits. And I think this is an issue because there is no standardized definition that schemes would be using for rare diseases. And there's no active way of actually even identifying them. We just fund based on the structured benefits, which I'm going to explain in the next slide. So I think this is the first issue, when it relates to rare diseases. And I think it's not unique to schemes. I think the definition issue is a universal problem. where, you'll have different definitions that are used in different, areas of with different stakeholders. But there is a requirement, obviously, to have one standard definition, specifically looking at our local setting. So just to give a sense of the medical scheme structure, the medical scheme benefit structure. So this is really just an overview. So if you think about most schemes, they will have base benefits. These will be benefits that, when we describe them, these are mainly your prescribed minimum benefits. They are same across schemes and plans. The implementation, though, may vary, and I think this is maybe well articulated even by Kelly, that you may find that the implementation of some of these benefits will vary from scheme to scheme, even though based on the fact that they are prescribed minimum benefits, some of these conditions, that at least the base basket should be the same. And I think the whole PMB review process was to try and simplify and also standardize access to treatments. And I think that's an important point to make. And then you'll have the non-PMB plan benefits, which will vary by scheme and plan type. But if you have bought a specific plan, the cover should be the same within the plan. So I think this is very important that, there may be some differences in terms of what people buy. But if you have bought the same plan, then you must have the same access to care. And then ex gratia is really discretionary and it's non-precedent setting. And this is what schemes decide over and above plan benefits and base benefits to fund for specific conditions and treatments. So if we think about rare diseases today, these are covered across this benefit spectrum. So some of them will fall in base benefits, some in the non-PMB plan benefits, and others in ex gratia. So the next slide is going to just speak more broadly around the base benefits, so that we have got a better understanding of what the base benefits look like. So I took this from the CMS website, where they're describing exactly what a prescribed minimum benefit should look like, and these they define as the sets of defined benefits that ensure that all medical scheme members have access to certain minimum health services, regardless of the benefit option they have selected. So regardless of the plan type, your base benefits should be the same. And the aim is really to provide people with continuous care, to improve their health and well-being, and to make healthcare more affordable. So if you think about the three categories of PMBs, so the first will be the medical emergencies, which the CMS also defines, and then a limited set of 271 medical conditions. These are DTPMBs, and then the 26 chronic conditions defined in the chronic disease list, and then the 27th will be HIV. So in the 271 medical conditions, these diagnostic treatment pairs will have, what we call as, with each medical condition in the 271, there will be then a definition in terms of what the member can access for those conditions. And this is very important because not everything that is listed is actually going to qualify for treatment, because maybe what is listed in the 271 will be just maybe the severe form of that condition and the specific intervention in terms of treatment relating to that condition. So if we think about rare diseases, remember, it's not only medical treatment, it can be a spectrum of surgical and medical interventions. So I think that's very important. So the one other aspect which CMS addresses is really PMB benefit definitions. And I think this is very critical because these definitions are geared towards creating that standardization across the industry so that there isn't this varied, access for members of the various schemes. And I think, they've been on this path for a very long time to try and create these benefit definitions, and they meet with the industry, they get inputs from the industry to ensure that all the input has been received. And the guidelines that then they create in their statement, they say they are based on evidence of clinical and cost effectiveness, and they take into consideration affordability constraints and financial viability of medical schemes in South Africa. So that is something that they factor into these benefit definitions. And I mean, they use also clinical experts from from even academic institutions to come and contribute to these benefit definition meetings. So this is very critical, because even when we think then about rare diseases, we are assuming that they may want to follow the same process, or they might want to have a different process that they follow for rare diseases in that space. So, sorry, things keep jumping here. Then from a medical schemes point of view, I just have a few points that I just want to spend some time on in terms of the considerations in the funding of rare diseases. I think I have almost highlighted the benefit structure. So what would then be the considerations that schemes have when they review rare diseases? I think firstly, we need to just acknowledge that there are no ring-fenced rare disease benefits. So if you go into schemes, rare diseases will fall under maybe the CDL, like if you think about multiple sclerosis, they will fall under the 271 DTP PMB conditions. I remember now I wanted to talk about the provisions. So within those 271, you've got the provisions. The provision actually says what the member's entitlement is. And there's usually, a corresponding list of ICD-10 codes that guide, the implementation of the 271 DTPMBs. And I mean, schemes will also take into consideration adverse selection when they think about rare diseases. And I think this is very important. It is part of managing scheme benefits and also just managing the risk for schemes. And for schemes, I mean, access to treatment is usually as per defined benefit structure, because I said there are no ring-fenced benefits. It means the benefit structure, which is your base benefits, your discretionary plan benefits, and your ex gratia will then apply depending on where that rare disease falls. Usually with rare diseases, we may not always have clinical guidelines to guide treatment and funding. And I think this is critical, because then benefit baskets will vary by scheme, because then everyone tries to create their own baskets of care. They will use whatever literature is available to actually try and create something. So that may actually compromise care in some instances because of the variability in terms of how these benefit baskets are put together. I think Kelly did touch on delayed diagnosis and treatment. And I think from a scheme's point of view, because members take long to be diagnosed, they may actually be, using various benefits to actually get to the final benefit where now they are, are diagnosed and they start accessing care. But the journey towards there may be actually very costly, and also not only costly to the schemes, but also to the member themselves. Because if for example, some of the screenings and the tests that they are doing are not covered as part of any benefit structure, there may be some out-of-pocket expenses that they may incur. And then some conditions actually do not have any treatments. And only supportive care is provided. And I think the nature of that supportive care, if there is no guideline, will also vary. And some members may actually fall short in terms of what they access from a supportive care point of view. In terms of benefit management, schemes use various tools, and I think designated service providers. And I think this one is quite tricky, because with rare diseases, there's also lack of expertise. So you may not necessarily find appropriate and adequate designated service providers to actually care for these patients. And in some instances, you may find that there are some professionals who have actually spent time to upskill themselves and to commit themselves to managing these patients, and they need to be recognized as such in terms of putting together as DSPs. And then formularies as well in terms of medication that's required. And I think the other key thing is really setting up of centers of excellence. I think right now, there aren't many of these, but there are pockets of centers of excellence addressing various aspects of rare diseases, and not only medical in terms of medication related treatments, but it could be surgical as well. I think, health technology assessments remains a very important tool in determining clinical value for any intervention that is used, even in the rare disease space. And I mean, that will also then take into consideration cost cost effectiveness of the interventions that are being recommended, and also the budget impact to the schemes. Affordability remains a real issue for some of the high cost and ultra high cost. When we say ultra high cost, when we look at treatments, over 1.5 million, this is just our own internal, cutoff point, disease treatments, where we're saying these are extremely ultra high cost and therefore need to be considered in a very, in a sustainable manner for the schemes. And I think equity in benefit allocation for both our rare disease patients and also patients with common conditions is very important. So from a scheme's point of view, we want to ensure that we're treating our members fairly, whether they've got a rare disease or they've got a common condition. And I think it's important not to forget our rare disease, considering that their conditions may not be well studied and they may actually feel marginalized and not taken care of because of some of the limitations in just understanding their conditions. So this is an important, diagrammatic representation of delayed diagnosis, which I found, and I thought it was quite interesting to share. And I think this is what patients go through because of lack of knowledge about the disease. There will be implicit biases, and multiple disease presentations may be what the patient presents with, and therefore may be misdiagnosed because of the different presentations. And the lack of available or accessible diagnostic tests. We know some of the patients need to access some of these tests from overseas. And it's really about, from a scheme's point of view, making sure that they do have access to some of those diagnostic tests. And also just understanding the cost related to that as well. And then there's misdiagnosis, where patients will be treated for something that they actually do not have until later on, months later, then the right person almost comes and intervenes and finds out what the real problem is with the patient. And access difficulties are a real issue, so they may not have access to the right care and to the right professionals at the right time. And there may be overlapping of symptoms with other conditions, and therefore resulting in the misdiagnosis. And they may have other coexisting conditions that may also just cloud the whole clinical presentation, and also inaccuracy of test results. And I think this is a painful journey for members, but it has got cost implications as well. So I think this slide really just highlights, if you look at the prevalence, it varies from, relatively prevalent, conditions to ultra rare, rare diseases. And I think this is important because for some of these cases, even the accommodation within benefits will vary. This list, as I look at it, there are some that are part of the chronic disease list. Some actually do not fall under any of the prescribed minimum benefit lists. And this is critical to just understand that while we may view rare diseases as a basket or a list of conditions, the way we view them obviously will be based on where they fit in within our benefits. And I think Kelly might have already touched on the fact that 5% of rare diseases, are treated with approved drugs. So it means the rest may not necessarily have any formal treatment. So it is really just supportive care. And 85% are actually very serious and life-threatening. And I think more than half of these conditions actually start in childhood, and you can see the prevalence. So it's, while we consider them rare, but if you look at the volumes in terms of patients, it is not a small number of patients who are impacted by rare diseases. So I think today, this is really the elephant in the room. If rare diseases were not as costly, in fact, the treatments, if we're not sitting with some of these ultra high cost interventions relating to rare diseases, maybe the conversations would be different, but this is the reality in this space. And I think I spoke about misdiagnosis, and I think when you think about this National Institute of Health study that showed that rare diseases have 3 to 5 times higher healthcare costs than those without a rare disease. This is not only talking about medication costs, it talks about the full care of patients. And I think that whole journey of misdiagnosis does contribute to the high cost nature of rare diseases. And I think it is something that we need to be very cognizant of and think about ways of creating efficiency in the system and allow for early diagnosis where possible. I mean, these are some of the costs of some of the drugs. I mean, I think Zolgensma will be one of the. I mean, it will be number one in terms of cost, in terms of just being expensive. Even though it's a once-off cost, but it is still a very, very costly drug, and may be unaffordable for most schemes. And I mean, there are other conditions and also treatments that I'm reflecting in this slide. And I think this is a topic of discussion, and I think we've engaged very extensively within industry to say this is an issue. While we are all aligned in terms of the needs of our rare disease patients, there is the affordability piece that needs to be addressed to make sure that there is sustainable access to care for our members and making sure that patients do access treatment timeously. So just taking Solaris as an example, our actuaries actually helped us to put together this opportunity cost example to say to fund one patient on Solaris, other patients would have to forego some of these, healthcare services. I mean, if you think about vaccinations and you look at the unit cost and you look at how many people you would have vaccinated. And this is really just to show from a cost point of view and not to take away from the benefits that the treatment will have for the individual. But when you try and look at the cost benefit, there is this aspect that needs to be addressed. And I think, we've looked at various, healthcare services, from preventative services to important, other interventions, and it ranges from age. I mean, you think about a premature baby to an elderly patient with a hip replacement, a woman who is delivering a baby. So it was just to showcase some of this stuff. And I think these are important considerations when you're thinking about healthcare spend and how you allocate resources. And I think some of these discussions, therefore, are important to have. So maybe to just end off with a few pointers, I think a definition is a starting point, a standardized definition across the industry, so that we are all understanding what we're referring to when we say rare diseases. And this then also translates into us being able to code for these conditions and being able to identify them. And if we want to structure differentiated benefits, then that's a starting point. I think innovative access models for rare diseases are something that we have already been discussing very extensively within industry. And I think there are various platforms where these discussions are taking place. I mean, there's an alternative reimbursement model, SteerCom, that is, in place, where we're thinking about, not only for rare diseases, just for high cost drugs, how we can create better access for members at a broader scale. And I think Section 36 exemptions did become part of that. And I mean, when we think about central procurement to actually ensure affordable access to high cost treatments, including those for rare diseases, and building local capacity for diagnosis, treatment, and follow up, because this is important, for quicker access to diagnostic testing, for quicker access to treatment, and making sure that members, of schemes and also treatment, patients in general have got access to care timeously. And setting up of registries for local data collection. And I think this is very key in improving care. Without data and understanding, what is happening with our rare disease patients, it's difficult to also innovate in terms of care, which is why we think setting up these registries and collecting the data and using this data for improvement of care is critical. And with that, it also allows for guideline development and making sure that there is standardization of care and improved clinical outcomes. I cannot overemphasize the importance of centers of excellence, and I think I'll just share a story around, our experience with one of the conditions where there was a clinician who was treating patients, and at the time when he passed on, there was no real proper transition for those patients in terms of their care, and it was a struggle to actually get these patients to the right type of care. It took another clinician who had a personal interest in the condition to actually look after these patients. And we felt that that was not ideal, because once you have a center of excellence, while it allows you to do most of the things that I've already highlighted in the top bullets, it also allows for continued upskilling of clinicians, because at the center of excellence, it should be ideally housed in an academic institution where you can have ongoing training. You have got skilled clinicians who are, exposed to these rare disease, patients and members, so that they are able to offer, proper care, on an ongoing basis. So we believe that centers of excellence not only allow you to improve patient outcomes, but, from a upskilling point of view, and also just, being able to implement some of the current gaps that we identifying in terms of just building capacity in the aspects of care for rare disease patients. It will be addressed through that structure. So I think, we do have this forum that was set up to actually have ongoing discussions around these points. I'm sure everyone who's going to be speaking today, there's going to be a lot of commonalities in terms of what we see as important, because I think the issues are real and the issues are the same. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm happy to take any questions if allowed.
Hi, Nolo. Thank you very much. That was a very informative presentation. We are running a few minutes late, or about 9 minutes late currently. There is one question that's popped up on the chat, and perhaps you'd like to answer that on live, just by typing the response. It's basically asking about the issue of genetic testing, with so many genetic tests not available in South Africa, and the need to send those samples overseas for testing. How can that be potentially covered by medical aids? Because typically it's not covered. And so you literally, that actually adds to the diagnostic odyssey, and almost contributes to that 7.5-year average time of getting a diagnosis, which in itself is a false economy, adding to the additional costs of healthcare and diagnostics and so on that are needed in the interim before you get that correct diagnosis. Or perhaps you'd just like to give a few words, because the comment come through on the chat is very similar to that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think it's really, it talks to the fact that we do not have a structured approach to rare diseases in the medical schemes. So what happens is that members who have got access to overseas treatment benefits, for example, will have access to some of these tests from their existing benefits. There are some benefits that will allow, because you find that the local labs are able to offer the testing, even though they still ship those specimens overseas. So it's not a neat process, if I can put it that way, Helen. It does require a lot of work and also just refinement. We've been engaging very extensively, for example, with the geneticists, because most of these conditions also have this genetic component. And in our discussions with them, because we do want to have a refined process around creating access and making sure that there's affordable access as well, negotiating with various parties, whether it's local or international, to create this process. What has come out from those discussions is also that sometimes, because of lack of skill, even the doctors, they don't know what to test for. The prof from VETS was actually saying some of the cases you find that you're doing this test and another test. By the time they actually do the right test, the patient has gone through so much other testing. So it's really, it's a space where we think there's room for improvement and just creating awareness, even from the clinicians, to say, these are the tests that you should be doing when people present this way, but also creating the necessary benefits for them. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I think we're going to table that discussion for some dedicated, further discussion later this afternoon. Yeah. I think there's been some comments coming in around that, but thank you very much for your presentation, and please do stay online for the discussion panel later. Yes. We look forward to hearing you for some more details on that then. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Helen. Thank you.
So apologies, we are running a little bit late, and I'd like to quickly introduce our next speaker, who's going to be bringing the industry perspective. Gavin Bauer, he is the market access head at Sanofi South Africa. He's been involved with the Sanofi Group for over 20 years in various different capacities, including market access and commercial roles. He's got a lot of experience in developing compelling medicine value arguments by using pharmacoeconomic principles, and he has successfully completed some work and some studies in health technology assessment from the University of Stellenbosch, and is involved in representing the pharmaceutical industry in many different industry fora, including IMSA, PASA, PTG, and so on. And he's got a real passion for ensuring that patient access to medicine is improved, to ensure improved patient health outcomes. So over to you, Gavin. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning to give a pharmaceutical industry view on the Rare Disease Access Initiative and what we think the practical steps are that we can contribute to improve patient access to rare diseases. So I'm just going to put my slides up, and I think we'll make up some time. So thanks for the opportunity, Kelly and the group. I think it's nice to present a pharma view and our perspective on how we think we can take patient access for rare diseases further. Just to give you a little bit of intro, those that don't know, that IPASA is a trade association. It represents 28 multinational pharma companies who are R&D based, and we basically represent about 43% of the total medicine sales in the private sector, so broadly representative of R&D manufacturers in South Africa. So to consolidate our view on rare diseases and the patient access initiative that we've been part of since initiation a couple of years ago, our view is rare diseases are by definition rare, and like Nolo was illustrating, the incidences and the prevalences do vary. But these are diseases that affect a very small subgroup of patients in South Africa, whether it be in private sector or public sector. But these patients have limited opportunities for diagnosis and treatment. The journey is complex and drawn out. And basically, these patients have a lack of certainty around diagnosis, treatment, funding, and then a lack of certainty around saying, what is my prognosis? What can be done going forward? And unfortunately, when one of these patients are diagnosed, they don't have a very clear pathway forward in terms of what can they access, who can they access, and will it be funded over a long period of time. For us, understanding the journey, like Kelly illustrated, I think we all understand that it's complex and challenging, whether it be the legal framework in the private sector or having patients trying to navigate the public sector in terms of trying to access treatments for these diseases. It is complex, it is challenging. But again, these patients have no predictability or certainty. And what we're trying to do with this initiative is to move from patient uncertainty to a scenario where we can provide these patients with certainty in terms of what they can look forward to in terms of improving their health outcomes. So these patients deserve access to appropriate treatments. And I think Nolo pointed out quite pointedly, when we make these decisions in terms of providing access or reimbursement, they need to be access to appropriate treatments in a sustainable manner. And I think that talks to the budget impact that Nolo was talking about. But at the end of the day, there's a patient at the end of this. So we want to improve patient outcomes for these patients through enabling access to diagnostics, to treatments, and then a situation where these patients can have a sense of hope in terms of their lives going forward. So from our point of view, implementing a rare disease policy framework where we've all agreed that there's a need. But I think where we are at the moment is we need some practical steps to move the conversation forward. And that means agreeing amongst ourselves as interested stakeholders that there are some practical steps we can do, and we take up the challenge to do that. So from a pharma point of view, what do we see to create certainty and predictability for all these patients and the stakeholders in the room today? Well, I think we've done a very good job around collective agreement that these patients are underserved, whether they be in the public or private sector. I think there's broad agreement around that. I think in number two, we've created a rare disease policy framework, which we've all agreed upon in the last year. The step now is, how do we commit to a coordinated plan where we can say, listen, we can do this in the short term, medium term, long term. Obviously, the long term is the NHI vision. But we have patients who are awaiting treatments today. So how do we work together to implement a rare disease policy framework that enables patient access and reimbursement and improves better health outcomes for these patients? So from a pharma point of view, what can we do? Sorry. If you look at the pharmaceutical sector, the positive upside is we bring the treatment solutions for these patients. And we must collectively decide that all South African patients deserve access to our medicines and the treatment solutions that we bring, regardless of which sector they access care into. So like Nola was saying, you know, if we have a centralized purchasing of rare disease medicines, that could be a solution. But it means that we take a collective view that all patients deserve access, not those that have private sector funding and need to access care in the public sector. We need to agree that all patients deserve access. The second thing, and this is a particular pharma view, is the South African pharmaceutical market is relatively small. It's less than 0.05% of the global pharmaceutical market. So when decisions are made to bring medicines into South Africa, the pharmaceutical sector needs to intentionally decide that South African patients deserve these deserve these treatments, and that we decide as a pharmaceutical industry that we're going to bring the medicines in because we believe the patients deserve access, and we will put a registration dossier in South Africa, and we'll put pressure on that regulatory timeline so that the patients can get access, either pre-registration to named patient section 21s or post-registration working with the payer in the private or public sector. So we need to be intentional about recognizing that South African patients deserve access to these medicines. And then third, I think Nolo pointed to it as, you know, we've spoken a lot about alternative reimbursement mechanisms, but the objective of doing alternative reimbursement models is to ensure patient access to innovative treatments, which they deserve. So I think we've done a lot of work around co-creating arms, but where the work is needed now is to implement some models which are proof of concept and to test the political commitment from the key stakeholders to say, we do believe for a subset of medicines that an alternative reimbursement mechanism will improve access, improve outcomes, and we can seek regulatory exemption to do that with the ultimate aim of ensuring a patient gets treated. I think so. There's a lot of work from pharma going into alternative reimbursement mechanisms, and I think we've had good support from other stakeholders like the payers to really say we need an alternative mechanism to provide access to these innovative treatments. And then number four, and I think that's what we're doing very well today, is we really need to support and invest in an ecosystem that advocates for rare disease patient access. And I think this grouping and meeting today is a real demonstration of a practical thing we're doing to ensure there's an ecosystem that supports these patients, but there's an investment in advocacy in terms of raising the issue with the policymakers and the decision makers so that they can understand, yes, there's a small subgroup of patients called rare disease patients, but they are as important as a HIV patient, a TB patient, a hypertension patient, or a diabetes patient. So these patients really need access to care, and we need to support and invest in this ecosystem that we're creating to ensure access to diagnosis and treatment. So these are practical steps that we can take as pharma. And I've put a quote right at the bottom of the page there, which comes from a meeting that we had. It's the multi-stakeholder forum looking at medicines access that advises the minister. This meeting was on the 23rd of August. And one of the action points from that meeting says South Africa needs to find a way to cater for people with rare diseases. And that's the first recognition we've seen in that forum that says, listen, rare diseases needs a solution for all patients in South Africa. So I'm encouraged that there's practical movement forward to find solutions that we can work on together to improve patient access for these treatments. So in summary, that I think is a short view from pharma. I think we're on the right track to implementing a rare disease policy framework that makes sense. I think it is good work that can lead to an NHI package which incorporates rare disease access and funding. But I think we will continue to work with all stakeholders as pharma to improve patient access to these treatments. And there's a willingness from our point of view to find innovative access models that really drive the outcomes for these patients in a very positive way. So thank you for the opportunity. I think I've saved some time, and I'm happy to stay on and take some questions as we proceed forward. Thank you very much, Helen.
Great job. Thank you so much, Gavin. There's no new questions come through at the moment. And I think because we're back on track, thanks for doing that. You did a great job. And I know that our next speaker has a time restriction. So if you do have further questions, I see there has been one popped up now. If we can just put that, you can look at that online, Gavin, and you can respond to that live by typing your answer, which is asking about an access initiative. Why doesn't Sanofi have an access initiative, an SA like in the Americas and Europe? But I'll allow you to, if you can just respond to that online, please. And thanks very much. And other issues we can table for our later discussion. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Matthew Bolt-Johnson. And he's going to really be bringing in the international perspective with regard to a lot of the issues that have already been raised and bringing a new idea to the table, essentially. So Matthew is from Rare Diseases International and EURORDIS, which is the European Patient Organization. He is the patient advocate working for EURORDIS and RDAI, and he's actively developing clinical networks around the world. And I've had the privilege of working with him in some meetings over the course of the last couple of years. He's got over 15 years experience working in the rare disease field. And previously he worked in the National Health Service in England as a hospital manager and commissioner and specialized in rare diseases and specialized healthcare. So I think we're bringing a wealth of experience to the table now from a different perspective and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you, Matt.
So thank you very much for inviting me to join you in South Africa. It's a shame it's online. I would love to be in South Africa. And thank you to Helen and Kelly for all your collaborations and support over the last couple of years. You've been very active representing the voice from South Africa, along with Pinky and Johnny. So I'm just going to outline the work which RDI has been doing with the WHO. So just to put it in context, we've been seeing emerging around the world clinical networks for rare diseases. These previously were informal collaborations or personal networks because of the complexities of rare diseases where clinicians have connected before. But now what we're seeing is that them being formalized and demonstrating proof of concept in Europe, in Japan, and in China. And we're seeing now other countries like in Canada, Brazil, and the US moving in this direction. In 2019 and 2021, we had a political declaration for UHC, which included rare diseases as a vulnerable population to access UHC. And in 2021, we had the new resolution to tackling the challenges of people living with rare disease and their families, which really advocates for nationally for member states to recognise their expert centres, get them to collaborate nationally and across a region and also internationally. We have formed an expert panel where we've got representatives Kelly and Helen and others in South Africa who've been co-designing together what would a global network for rare diseases look like. We have a formal MOU with the WHO, which started in 2018, one key aspect of that MOU was to work together to develop something called a global network for rare diseases, seeing that this global network, which can connect expert centres across a country and across a region globally, to get them to support local action to improve UHC. So honouring and implementing that political declaration back in 2019. So we're in the third year of the MOU at the moment, but I'll just give you a vision what that network would look like. So locally, we want to identify the expert centres, and we've heard today that in South Africa, there's pockets of expertise, which are international leads and leading the way across Africa as well and internationally. But we want to get that more formalised and more of those experts recognised formally, and to get them to work together as a national network and to connect into regional networks. So these regional networks, we think there'll be about potentially 15 to 18. And by setting up these regional networks, that should also go to supporting and encourage member states to recognise their centres to also connect at a regional level. But globally, what we want to do is to form this global network where we have participants who will have a steering committee and we'll have some disease cluster working groups. But the key will be for this global network, which will be hosted by the WHO, is to ensure that these people who sit around this table are representatives of these regional networks and representatives of national leading centres. We've completed the technical work. We're concluding the technical work at the moment. We did a needs assessment where we had very good representation from all the regions, including Africa and South Africa. We co-designed together, and this has the blueprint of all our community, the DNA of this model for a global network. We co-designed together to meet those needs we've identified. We turned that model into an operational framework, and we recommended an approach with the WHO for them to set up the network based on an approved terms of reference, and a technical officer is being recruited at the moment. So the terms of reference are there. When the technical officer is in post, they'll implement those terms of reference to enable us to start the pilot network. So we're at that point now. And at the moment, we're developing our mobilisation plans. So as I mentioned, we're completing this year our conceptualisation of the work, and we're moving to action. This was an event which we held in Geneva back in May as a side event to the World Health Assembly. And this was really the first, us moving from that conceptualized thinking into action. So it's really important now that we build support and awareness locally in South Africa, in Southern Africa as well, to connect your national authorities with the WHO to say, this sounds interesting, this sounds what we need and we can benefit from, and we can share our expertise in to help shape what that pilot looks like. So we've done a call to action for our people from the panel of experts to connect with their national authorities. So please connect with your national authorities in South Africa. I believe that, I've connected with Johnny Malango from who has the International Treatment Centre for Haemophilia, and learning from what Johnny does across Africa in terms of capacity building, building expertise, sharing knowledge, learning from real world evidence of therapies being used. I mean, what you do in Africa, we can learn from around the world. It's scalable, it's transferable. So what we really need is the leadership from your national policy leads or your national authorities to set forward and just say, hey, let us get involved in this, because I can't see a pilot going forward where we haven't got good representation from Africa and from South Africa leading this. So the global network we want to set up is a hub and hub model. So we want to recognise national hubs, regional hubs, national hubs connecting under regional hubs, and also global hubs. The idea that no matter where you live, you can connect into the global network and access global knowledge to inform local care. So these national hubs are very much like knowledge adapters to plug into that global system. So national hubs, we think it could be one centre, it could be multiple centres. It's for you to define. It's about these hubs are very much about coordinating, connecting people in. It connects the system in South Africa. It doesn't connect one hospital or one expert. It connects everyone in. So national hubs we see as doing optimizing what you know and what you have locally. Regional hubs we see as sharing expertise and leveraging what others know and have. Whereas global hubs we think it's not about what we know, it's about what we don't know, and it's about learning and discovering together. We had to look at, and we did this work where we tried to look, well, how do we build regional hubs? And when we looked at around the world, we said, well, there's lots of countries already collaborate together. In South Africa collaborates a lot across Southern Africa, and patients and referrals are made down to experts in South Africa and go back to the other countries there. So we looked at where there's shared a history of an existing collaboration which is happening at the moment. We identified that. We looked at where there's shared expertise, experience, shared culture, shared language. And you can see if we look at Africa as a whole, it probably falls into about 4 sort of regional hubs. So the global network, the pilot will be to experiment with new ways of working, to pool expertise, to try out how do we do that? What's the best way to do that? How can we use digital tools to do that? To build knowledge and to share knowledge and to provide virtual consultation. We'll have participants of the network, the pilot network, and it's important that they bring their expertise locally. So you have locally in South Africa huge expertise which the pilot network can benefit from. So we need your leaders to step forward and take part so we can learn globally from you. We'll have a steering committee. We'll have some working groups to figure out new ways of to look at common needs and policy recommendations around them. And we want to develop these regional and global hubs as well. So we'll probably in the pilot do 1 or 2 of those hubs. We'll pilot them to test the model and to check it works. Example of the different activities. So virtual consultation, currently there's an initiative across the East Mediterranean region called Cure for You initiative. They bring together over 200 expert surgeons and trainee doctors to do virtual case review of surgical cases. Now that's a platform which we can see what could be used in other parts of the world. I mentioned earlier about Johnny's centre, the International Treatment Centre in South Africa. You know, that will be a great example of how we can build capacity across a continent, because South Africa leads there with Mauritius, Mozambique, Senegal, and other countries. So doing case reviews, twinning programs. So that would be a great example to learn from under the WHO pilot. Pooling knowledge and maybe getting greater access to diagnosis. We've got in Europe, we've got the ERNs, so they could look at getting support from the European Commission to provide diagnostic support broader, whether it's in Africa or in Southeast Asia, for metabolic conditions. And hopefully these give you a real flavour of what a pilot network will do. I mean, it will take time to fulfill a global network of 15 regional hubs connecting globally. It will take time to do that. We recognize that, but this is the first step, is just experimenting. In the US, they've done a Centre of Excellence program, which is being led by Nord. We could see about learning from that and seeing, well, is that model transferable to other countries and other regions? We looked at a baseline assessment and seeing who's ready. And as you can see, we put South Africa being ready, and we define readiness not based on maturity of system or level of resources. It was about willingness and commitment to take part and collaborate. That's really important. About seeing whether there's an existing collaboration which we can build on and expand, and I believe there is, listening to you today, and looking to secure support from the hospitals and the national authorities as well, because it's not individuals taking part, it should be the institutions and the country as a whole. So we're just doing a little look. So we had a call earlier this week, and Kelly and Helen were active on it as well. So in South Africa, we believe that there's existing infrastructure to develop on. The development of a new rare disease specialist centre in the northwest of South Africa. You've got the Southern African Human Genomics Network, I believe that's the correct title. You've got experts in South Africa connected to the main academic hospitals. and that referral systems and collaborations across the region as well. Some other countries as well, Congo, Botswana, Ghana, and Kenya seem to be in a good place as well, but we continue to engage and to learn in this area. So I'm here to say to you, we really need Africa and South Africa to be a leader in the pilot network. Possible actions to do locally. We encourage you to have national discussions about this initiative, about taking part in the pilot and developing a national hub, identifying key stakeholders who could come together, identifying local needs and priorities. And I think Kelly did a fantastic job of highlighting that this morning. And looking at raising awareness of this initiative and securing national authority support. Building on that existing, identifying those existing infrastructure we can build from, but get involved. So if you want to get involved in this further, please connect with Rare Disease South Africa and with RDI. But we would like to maybe develop a case study of South Africa and Southern Africa to demonstrate proof of concept. So we would like more active discussions there. So I know this is about access, and this is my last slide. So I thought I'd put in something about, well, you know, that's great, we identify centres, but what value is it in building an access to affordable treatments? So by identifying expert centres, that enables the patient's community to see who are the experts for those conditions and access them. So that enables them to be afforded with accessing a diagnosis. So you start to build in those centres the patient numbers and the data and to learn from in terms of reporting back to your government around the burden for those conditions, and getting rare diseases recognised as a priority and budget there as well. So by doing that, you also enable the hospitals then to be able to provide or the opportunity for people to access treatments and get that real world experience. That's what we've been seeing in haemophilia, of how it's effective and how that's then reducing the pressure on the hospital system because people are well and not needing as much care. Seeing that health technologies assessments being put in place and that making it more attractive for industry to think, well, let's commercialize this, let's put our therapy, which we've done in other parts of the world and been approved, through the system here locally, because you've got this pathway built up. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. It's nice to be on the other side this time with you presenting and me kind of doing the supportive role. So I think having had the call earlier this week, it's just great to be able to share this more widely within our country now. And just the things that have been running through my head in terms of, I think it's reassuring just knowing that, you know, rare diseases are a global issue, but it's reassuring to know that, you know, practically we are using the models and the success stories from elsewhere in the world to make a difference here in South Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, where we know that we're so far behind in so many aspects. But it's also refreshing to hear you say that, you know, we have something to bring to the table and that others may learn from us as well, because in many cases, things were developed in a more ad hoc fashion and piecemeal, whereas we have the, I guess, the advantage in a sense, being able to sit and consider all the different options and get it more comprehensive, perhaps from the beginning. Would you agree with that?
I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Rare Diseases South Africa and other patient groups and experts in the African region, and it is inspiring to see what you achieve and what you do. And I think it's what's great is they're more affordable, it's more scalable and transferable to other regions as well. And I think you bring that expertise, that experience you've gained locally of making things work in a very specific environment and how your system is. And I think I definitely see that you are leaders in rare diseases, and we look to you to see how you solve some of these challenges, because it helps others do that as well.
Thanks, Matt. And I think it's just encouraging because I think this process is also kickstarting some, us to rally within country. And I'm sure you've seen that across the world to get our own houses in order so we can have a national hub that can connect with a regional hub and so on. So I'm really excited to look how this is going to expand over the next year and to our further involvement. And thank you very much. And if anybody else, if other questions come up related to this project, I'll be sure to email them through so you can respond to those, because I know you do have a time limitation. Hi, welcome back, everybody. I hope you managed to run to the bathroom and grab yourself a drink, whether it be coffee to keep you going or early wine, either's fine. So just a few words just to carry over from the last speaker, and Matt from Rare Diseases International. I think another thing that he really highlighted is our responsibility to our continent as well. And it was interesting in a call we had yesterday with Matt, is that a number of other countries from Africa were on the line, and particularly those in Southern Africa were indicating, that they still refer patients here because they don't have the services. And I think we need to be cognizant of that as we go forward. It's not just for our own people, but we need to think about those additional patients that are coming from elsewhere and how we can actually help them in building their capacity, perhaps as we build our own. So moving on to our next speaker, I'm really happy to introduce you to Professor Chris Forster from Northwest University, who is going to speak to the diagnostic challenges related to rare disease in South Africa and what do we need to correct in order to move forward. So Chris qualified in 1998 as a medical doctor, and then he specialized in chemical pathology. He's worked in the private healthcare sector previously and then joined Northwest University. He's currently the director of the Center for Human Metabolomics, the CHM, which is both a research and a commercial entity at Northwest University, which aims to establish sophisticated metabolomics infrastructure and expertise in South Africa. And that capacity that he oversees includes the National Metabolomics Platform, diagnostic services for inherited metabolic diseases and newborn screening, as well as several national and international contract research projects and the newly established Rare Disease Biobank in Northwest University. So thanks very much, Chris, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to talk about the diagnostic services and challenges and also achievements a bit more from a practical perspective. I'm a very practical person, and all of the political stuff I normally leave to Helen. But yeah, let me show you my thoughts on this, and then we can discuss it in the question and answer session. So I think this is obvious, but it's perhaps important just to mention it, is that we're not talking about the ordinary. We're talking about the out of the ordinary. So migraine, hypertension, even things like coronary artery disease, which requires major intervention, and brain tumors is not what we're talking about. We're talking about those diseases that are very rare, where the private sector is often very poorly equipped to identify them. Public sector is actually, in my mind, a little bit better equipped because they don't work in silos. The diagnostic cost is typically moderate to very high. And sadly, a lot of patients are undiagnosed simply because they can't afford to get a diagnosis with very little support from medical aids. So this is just a schematic diagram of the diagnostic odyssey of a rare disease patient. Start with a clinical assessment. Now, at this stage, of course, the patient can already be missed, but let's just assume for the moment that a rare disease is suspected. Then there are really two possibilities. The one is that it could be very, very typical, which would basically almost lead to a clinical diagnosis or a very narrow differential. And the next step would then be to decide whether this is metabolic or not. And there are certain clinical features that helps you to make the decision. If it is metabolic, you would start off with metabolite testing and enzyme testing and possibly genetic confirmation, whereas if it's not, you would probably start with genetic testing, and you would need to have a strategy of how you're going to deal with the uncertainties in the result that you're going to receive. However, if you have a patient that is not typical, so the patient fits in a particular clinical group, so just as an example here, I mentioned atypical epilepsy, patient doesn't respond to treatment, etc., or hepatosplenomegaly, for which there's no apparent cause, then you would need to have a diagnostic approach. And this is where it can actually become quite expensive. So, and the approach would typically include some routine testing, metabolic testing, enzyme, genetic imaging, and possibly also histology. Now, what I always advise is that you need orthogonal confirmation. So for all of these diagnostic modalities, whether it's clinical, metabolite, enzymology, genetics, there are pitfalls, and because the impact of a diagnosis is great, I always advise to have at least 2 diagnostic strategies to confirm a diagnosis, and be careful of overemphasizing genetic testing. So we often find that medical aids do not want to treat because there's no genetic result. I can show you lots of examples of patients where an incorrect diagnosis was made due to genetic testing. So you need 2 strategies to make a diagnosis. We try to offer support along the diagnostic odyssey. Most clinicians do not deal with these patients regularly, so they're often uncertain on how to work them up. So what we do is of course, we do a lot of training. We pretty much offer 24/7 telephonic support. We advise the use of decision support software, although I think you need to be fairly experienced to actually get value out of that. We have some approaches that we offer to clinicians, and also I think what there's still a need for is more guidelines. From a laboratory perspective, there's almost like a revolution going on in the laboratory at the moment. So we are retiring what we call legacy methods at quite a fast rate at the moment, coming up to sensible omic approaches that's going to increase the diagnostic yield greatly. We are working towards precision diagnostics, where we are going to remove the uncertainty in results. However, where I think there is a great gap at the moment is that in the laboratory, we are limited to what the clinician has requested. And I think, this is something that should be addressed. There's a lot that we can offer to assist the clinician to get to a diagnosis faster, or even not to use a particular modality. So sometimes I'll have a clinician that contacts me and I'll tell them, look, don't send us any samples. We're not going to be able to assist you. You need to refer to a geneticist or something along that line. So this is just an example for you. This is a fairly common scenario in inherited metabolic diseases, a patient that presents with an acute or recurrent encephalopathy. There's a little bit of the clinical presentation and then the approach. Thankfully, these patients are often admitted, and I show you a little bit on the detail of how these patients should be worked up. For example, I also say that MRI is most of the time not useful, trying to save some cost. But this is the kind of testing that you would require for these patients. So quite an extensive basic laboratory test, some tests that you need to be selective of, and then even your basic metabolic test is quite extensive and it's expensive. A workup like this is going to cost, just thumbsuck, between 6,000 and 10,000 Rand. So this is what I would advise to clinicians when I do presentations. Now, if you look at a chronic or progressive encephalopathy, these patients are often not admitted. So you would need the same kind of testing, and then in addition to that, you would need some more advanced testing as well. So the costs become very, very expensive quite quickly. And these costs are, of course, has to be covered by the patient's savings account. So, most of the patients simply cannot afford to be worked up properly. Now, I want to move on to an example. So a couple of years ago, we started an initiative with Sanofi to diagnose some of the patients for which they have enzyme replacement therapy for. It's not all of the patients, but at least some of them, they do have enzyme replacement therapy for. And I want to just show you what happens when all of the components come together to make a diagnosis. So at first they funded us to develop some of the methodology that's required to make the diagnosis. And this is just what I show here, the 6-plex LSD test. And what has resulted from that is that we now have a test that is reimbursed by Sanofi, where once the patient enters this diagnostic process, all of the costs are covered. So we do the 6-plex based on the results. There are genetics that gets done overseas. There are other metabolite and enzymatic tests that may be triggered in a reflex way. And in this way, we are able to diagnose the patients that are covered in the 6-plex enzyme assay. So these are 6 lysosomal enzymes that's covered in this test. And this is at no cost to the patient. So we don't have financial constraints. And as the result of that, in the last 2.5 years, we've diagnosed 65 patients. Now, these patients we have never or very, very seldomly encountered in the past. So this is all new to us. And all of a sudden, these patients are on the radar. MPS II, which I think people may be familiar with because of recent court cases and so on, is very common in South Africa. I think in the 10 years before this, I saw one patient, like one MPS II patient. And it just shows you the power of having proper diagnostics in place. So this is also an interesting slide. A couple of years ago, I just did an assessment of, the conditions that we diagnose, and it's not that out of the ordinary: propionic aciduria, methylmalonic, cystinuria, tyrosinemia, galactosemia, and so on, the normal or the more common metabolic diseases. Now, if you do that analysis now, then all of a sudden MPS II is now the condition that we diagnose the most frequently in our facility. Now, this is not because MPS II is the most common metabolic disorder. This is because of sophisticated diagnostics combined with I'd almost say aggressive training of clinicians to be able to spot these patients. So this is the potential that can happen. So we've done this very successfully for 6 lysosomal disorders, but of course I want to move on from this. So what's in the pipeline now is a whole exome sequencing project, which is going to run before the end of this year still. So we will run a research project with around about 60 patients that's undiagnosed at the moment. And I can tell you now that by end of 2023, there will be diagnostic whole exome services, whole exome sequencing services in South Africa available. Whether or not it will be funded, I don't know. But for some of our patients, this is going to be the route to getting to a diagnosis. All of the components that is required to do this, the instrumentation, the bioinformatics, and the interpretation is available in South Africa, and there's no reason why we can't do this locally. So just to close off with just a few comments on the call for National Rare Diseases Framework from my side. So, I think one of the most important things is, that stakeholders need to come to the table. And really, unfortunately, if I have to mention one, it would be the medical aids. So for me, it's very hard to understand how a medical aid can calculate exactly how many steps I need to take before I can get a free coffee, but they can't tell me at what price they can afford enzyme replacement therapy. An answer like "we can't afford it," that closes the discussion. And I think the medical aids need to come to the discussion table. We are very aware of the limitations, and I'm thankful for Noluthando for presenting, some actual data that we can have a look at. I'm not a rare disease patient. I don't want my medical aid to be depleted because of rare disease patients, but we need to have sensible discussions on how this can be addressed, and we also need to be unified. Perhaps if we can present this together to industry, then we can get better prices negotiated. I think we have different interests, but we should try and align interests as far as possible. Obviously, the main interest should be to improve the outcome of our patients. The second thing is if ever there was a time in history when this is required, then it's now, is the establishment of an advisory board. If we don't establish this now, we're just going to see the number of medical legal cases increasing. We've tried to get this going a couple of times in the past, but the real issue is sustainability. So, typically the people that you require in such an advisory board, they don't come cheap, and somehow they have to be reimbursed for the time that they put into this. And I think there's a couple of ways in which that could be done, if we start to work together. I've recently been involved in establishing the guidelines for one rare disease. I'm not going to mention which one, but I think you've probably seen it quite soon. And the one thing that I became very aware of is that we actually don't need physical centers of excellence. If you look at the guidelines, most of the information that is required can be collected by a general practitioner. However, the interpretation of that needs to be done by an expert. So you need a virtual center of excellence. And also, I don't think that physical centers of excellence is the way to go in South Africa. It may work for one disease, but if you consider 7,000 rare diseases, then obviously that's not the way to go. Of course, I don't want to close down COEs that already exist. I'm just pointing out that, we could also rely on virtual centers of excellence. If you take, for example, something like tyrosinemia, if we say that we are not going to treat these patients with nitisinone and we're going to go for liver transplant, the data that you require to monitor this patient and to select them for transplantation doesn't need a physical center of excellence. What you do need is a center of excellence in liver transplantation. So we don't need centers of excellence for rare diseases, but we need centers of excellence that can provide some of this very sophisticated treatments. I also have to just point out that there are many rare diseases that can be treated very, very cost effectively. So at this stage, it seems to me that it's easier to get a patient onto enzyme replacement therapy at hundreds of thousands per month in comparison to a biotinidase patient that only requires biotin. Very, very cost effective, but patients struggling to get the benefits from the medical aids. Once we have an advisory board, I think, that could go a great way to the establishment of diagnostic and treatment guidelines that really should dictate to industry how this should be done. And then, of course, the education and training that can come with that as well. The whole process of diagnosis when it comes to a rare disease patient is very different from more common diseases. And there's no ways in which patients can afford this from their savings account. So this needs to come from the fund. And I'm not saying that this should be a free for all. Obviously there needs to be an evaluation process and so on. But there are many undiagnosed patients simply because they can't afford a diagnosis, and we need to end that. It cannot continue like that for any longer. And then also agree that research is probably key here, and biobank and registries are critical. We have established the Rare Diseases Biobank, but at this stage it's going out on a limb a bit. We need some funding to get that going. And just to come back to this idea is there is a lot of opportunity from corporate and other sources to get funding, and maybe we need to come up with a mechanism in which we can pool this funding and prioritize things so that they can get funded, and that we can make some progress in the next 10 years to come. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. Very easy to listen to presentation as always, but very packed full of all the important issues that we actually need to discuss. There's one question that's popped up, a comment really from Sarita saying that she can't agree with you more. Genetic testing in understudied populations such as we have in South Africa should be approached very carefully in the absence of biochemistry. And your comment that you made, Chris, about, we can't overemphasize genetic testing is so true. And that's a hurdle that we really faced recently in setting up the Rare Disease South Africa. We call it the Genetic Hub, but we are including other things in there. But because nobody has an overall picture of what's available in South Africa in terms of testing, whether it be biochemical or genetic or otherwise, and going forward with whole exome. So we're trying to make a start with that. And I believe that you guys are on board already, and we're listing all your tests available so that clinicians and healthcare providers can click on the link. But I'd like to come back to an important point you raised about, pick up the phone the lab, find out what does the lab actually suggest. And it also echoes back to a comment I think made by Gavin about unnecessary tests being made. Do you have a little bit more to say about that?
Yeah, and this is where I think, it comes back to having that advisory board, and from there on developing guidelines and so on and how it should be done. But in the interim, Marley and myself are available pretty much 24/7. So if you want to know, which test to request, then just phone us. The problem comes in when the samples arrive in the lab, in the patients in ICU is critical. Urine amino acids have been requested. Should have been serum amino acids. We do the analysis on urine because we can get some information from that, but then ultimately what leads to is a request for serum, where serum should have been requested from the start. I'll put my cell phone number in the comments section, so anybody's welcome to phone me anytime if you would like to have some advice on which test to request. We are very cognizant of the cost of testing, so we don't want to have unnecessary testing. We want to have appropriate testing, but we also want the ability to work up patients completely. So if we do the enzyme analysis or the metabolic analysis, and it is highly suggestive, then we also want to be able to do the genetics. And currently, this is what's lacking. As you know, it's strange to me that a patient can be in an ICU at a cost of 30,000 a day, and that's covered, but a gene panel cannot be covered. So yeah, these are. I think there are some serious problems in the industry that needs to be addressed. And again, coming back to the advisory board that needs representation from all stakeholders, medical aids, pharma, labs, clinicians, and so on. If ever there's a time for this, it's now.
No, thanks for that, Chris. And I think let's come back to that advisory committee just to talk a little bit more about it in the discussion a bit later, because it would be interesting to unpack that idea a bit further and get further inputs. So thank you very much. We are slap bang on time now, which is fantastic. So thanks for that as well. So thanks, Chris, and please stay on the line so that we can come back to you later and take a look at the questions popping up on the Q&A. And Riona, we have seen your question. We're going to pull that through to the discussion later. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who's Professor Johnny Peter from the University of Cape Town. He is a physician and specialized in internal medicine at UCT. And in February 2016, he was registered with the HBCSA as the first adult allergologist in South Africa. You're going to come back to that, please, Johnny. And is the head of the Division of Allergology and Clinical Immunology at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town and at the Allergy and Immunology Unit. So his current clinical interests and focus includes immune-mediated adverse drug reactions. You've got a lot of really long names in here. So I'm going to hand it over to you to explain more about what you're doing and how this can really add to the journey for rare diseases in South Africa. Thanks very much, Prof.
Thanks very much for the invitation. And yeah, the names can be a bit of a mouthful. So what I wanted to really kind of bring to this forum is kind of the story of our journey in looking after patients with hereditary forms of angioedema so far in South Africa. And really to, I think, highlight a lot of the aspects here. And already this morning we've been talking about, virtual or centers of excellence, virtual centers of excellence, and the role of patient organizations and all the various stakeholders in kind of moving the key issues forward. And so just to start to orientate people, what is angioedema? What am I talking about? I think it's good. There are lots of rare diseases. Good to orientate everybody to what this particular issue is. So angioedema is just sudden sort of pronounced swelling of the submucosal tissues, actually, and the mucous membranes. Now, this can happen for patients at any time with minor trauma, and it can affect any body part. However, the main issue is that very occasionally, it does happen, it can affect your larynx. And if it affects your larynx, this is a life-threatening situation. And unfortunately, death from asphyxia can ensue within a few hours, unfortunately. Now, one of the real challenges we have, as for many rare diseases, although some rare diseases fortunately have very sort of pathognomonic presentations, which alert doctors to the diagnosis. The problem with angioedema is that angioedema is actually not uncommon. And so we recently, for instance, audited the Cape Town metros in terms of cases of presenting with angioedema. And there were about 5 cases presenting there a week with angioedema of various kinds. Now, angioedema can, without wheals or without urticaria, can be caused by what a lot of people think, which is just sort of allergic conditions or mediated by something called histamine. And it can be anything from a drug allergy through to a food allergen. In fact, in our Cape Town setting and our population, the commonest cause is, in fact, a result of the antihypertensive medications, ACE inhibitors. But there's a group of patients on the end here which have genetic forms of angioedema where the driving pathology or the driving mechanism is through something called bradykinin. And as a result, the key thing about this is that if it's not recognized and diagnosed, all of the treatments you would use for allergy don't work. They're ineffective and they're wrong. And in addition, picking out these rare cases and actually making the diagnosis is a very difficult thing within the context of all these other non-hereditary and non-genetic presentations. So it poses some very difficult challenges. And what we've been fortunate enough to do is to work with the patient organization for hereditary angioedema. And we now in the country, we have a cohort of about 110 or 15 patients. It's also an autosomal dominant condition, although new mutations arrive in about 25%. But often when you diagnose one case, you can then diagnose an entire family of cases. And some people have been having swellings for their whole life and have been fortunate enough to not have a severe swelling and have been recognized, but and have just not known what the diagnosis is. We've been fortunate enough recently to put together some videos of patient stories, and I'm going to show one now because to me it really is a sad story that speaks to many of the challenges that I've already raised, some of them, and also some of the aspects around the problems of care and some of the aspects that we've just been discussing. And I hope it works.
My name is Mzwandile Nkelenjane, and I've got a daughter and a son that have HAE. I knew his mother was having that HAE. Snovio was 5 or 6 years, if I'm not mistaken, but it was that age when she was starting having the signs of an HAE. She was so vibrant child, yeah. Yeah, she was a good child, man, very good child. She was also got a lot of confidence as young as that age. She liked to told me that at that time, no, Daddy, when I'm old, you want to be a nurse. Well, she says she saw some nurses sometimes at the hospital when she went there by the Red Cross Hospital. She was at school the time that the HAE attacked him. She told the teacher, and then she told him there is a pain on the throat. Yes, and then the teacher said, no, okay, the transport is gonna come, and then it's gonna take him home. And then after that, the driver came and fetched him. And then on the way to home, the driver, he also told the driver that he's got a problem on the throat. And that time I was not at home, and my ex-wife was also not at home. And then they arrive at home, and then they see Norman, there is this problem is serious now. And then they take him to a hospital at Guguletu. They were not sure what to do. I think maybe they don't know what was HIE at that time. She died there after that. It didn't take long. It was very hard, very hard. It was we didn't expect it. And also it was our first daughter. When Snovio died, she affected him big time. I think she could be saved, or could make a big difference if they know everything about that. And then there was more information about HAE, and especially the schools, the nurses, the doctors, and the government then give support. Yes. My son now is having the medication that is taking every day. And Snovio at that time, she didn't have the same medication that he should take it. She should take it. And maybe if she can have this medication that my son took it, maybe she can save him his life. Yeah. We are starting the center to create more awareness to HAE. I think this center is going to be a center that is going to be useful, going to be helping a lot of people, going to also communities and all, and including together with the doctors. And the center is created in the memory of Snovio Nkelenjane. The name of Snovuyo in isiXhosa, it means we are happy when Snovuyo was born. At least the spirit of him can live long for this center is.
So that really sad, tragic story to me highlights several aspects of kind of why we work in this region and why we try to do what we can for this patient population. But it also highlights, I think, some important issues around the whole pipeline of a patient with a rare disease. And it's not simply about the treatments. And I know we've talked about it already this morning about, access to very expensive treatments. Some of the things for me that this highlights in this case are things about knowledge for the patients, knowledge for doctors, accessing the right appropriate level of cares, because actually saving a person's life with hereditary angioedema of the larynx is actually just about getting them to a place where their airway can be protected, irrespective of whether they can be treated. And so there's a lot still to be done, and obviously diagnosis is very important. So to me, this highlights several of the areas that we're working on. And so as a kind of unit and as a center, what we focused on doing is two aspects here. The one is about trying to get an improved treatment access and also education, and then a more broader perspective within the country and within the continent of trying to expand awareness and improve diagnosis. And just to add that both are ongoing and a work in progress. If you look specifically now at treatment accesses, if you take us back a few years to 2019, the majority of patients, and this was mentioned on the video, in order to try and prevent these attacks, we give patients attenuated androgens in the form of Danagen or Danazol. And we have about 50% of our cohort on this. In children, we tend to use tranexamic acid. Now, this therapy globally is being recognized as problematic with a lot of impacts, especially for women. So it's in a way a suboptimal long-term therapy, and there are several new options in the pipeline. And for acute attacks, so when somebody presents with the swelling, the actual, again, there are now several modern medicine and treatments available, but the fallback, which is still used throughout the world and in many places in South Africa, is the use of fresh frozen plasma. And I can see here that's very different from treating for an allergy attack. And knowing what to do and how to do this is very key. I wanted to also put this up here because actually largely driven again by patient organizations internationally and collaboration with scientists and the pharma communities. Over the last 2 decades, this particular condition has actually seen a fantastic pipeline of development of agents. And you can see on the top of this timeline, I've indicated some of the therapies, and these therapies are what we call targeted therapies. So they're disease specific. So icatibant is one that targets the receptor that this problematic peptide binds to. Some of these replace the actual missing agent, and then some of these target other pathways, problems within the kallikrein pathway that lead to this. And you can see here that in South Africa, we have lagged quite far behind. In fact, we sort of only in 2009 did we really even publish about this disease for the first time in South Africa. And then only really as the HAE South Africa patient organization has picked up, linking with the international group as well, have we managed to start to change the access to certain medications for our country. The other thing that we've done, and I think other people have mentioned this already, is getting our own data specifically around costs was critical to discussions with our local health providers. And so this study that we published now a few years ago looked at and is actually the largest cohort of acute attacks treated with fresh frozen plasma. And we collaborated with colleagues with a similar cohort of hereditary patients in Iran. And what we showed here was that, although FFP, these fresh frozen plasma, does work, it works several hours longer than some of the target medicines. And patients therefore have to get admitted to hospital, have to stay overnight, and it's very disruptive. And not only is it disruptive to the patient, but we also did just a simple costing. And what we were able to demonstrate very clearly here is that treating patients with a full journey through the health system was around just under $800 an incident or an acute attack. And actually, again, once we were able to access a global access program for one of the treatments, we could demonstrate that one of these targeted therapies that could keep somebody out of hospital was in fact almost an equivalent price. And that piece of information was very helpful for us unlocking, particularly within the public sector and in with the private sector, funding and support for these new medicines. And really just to say that I don't think any of this progress for us would have been possible without this strong patient organization. HAE South Africa is a branch of HAE International. And then also with our group, even from a scientific and academic point of view, we have linked with other bigger networks. And there's something now called the Angioedema Care Network System, which is essentially about 80 centers of excellence internationally for conditions related to angioedema. And you can see here, this is one example where we've been able to now, through this global access program, we managed to get almost 30 of our patients accessing what we call a recombinant C1 inhibitor replacement therapy for the treatment of their acute attacks. So that was been an excellent success. And then it's sort of snowballed from there, because in addition to this, Takeda, a company, arrived, and this drug, icatibant, which is another targeted therapy, came off patent. And as a result, the combination of the arrival of Takeda and sort of rollout in South Africa together with this coming off patent means that they've also introduced an early access program. The prices have really come down very nicely. And you can see this is now again a price that's lower than what we've shown for the treatment of acute attacks with fresh frozen plasma. And on the basis of this, we've actually managed to get both these drugs to our patients within the public sector. And the dossier, again, for this particular agent is already in process at SAHPRA, and hopefully next year we'll actually see registration of this medication. Then the other thing we have used, and I know several colleagues that do and work in different rare diseases use clinical trials as an important way as well of helping us access medication. But this has been probably my biggest success story in terms of long-term prophylaxis for hereditary angioedema patients. We were involved in this new drug that is now registered with the FDA and the EMA, and we managed to enroll 16 of our patients on this, and 12 of these patients now, almost 4 years later on the trial, are still accessing this prophylactic medicine with very good effect, and this is providing an excellent alternative to androgen therapy. Then the other thing on the other side, so that's sort of treatment, but what about this issue of actually picking up cases? Because we really need to have knowledge about this. And so one of the things is we have been in collaboration with a group in France that has set up, and they started it 10 years ago in France. They set up an angioedema hotline. And basically it's a simple concept where this is a number that anybody, doctors, patients, people can call if they're facing a problem of angioedema and what to do. And the French group, France has got a very similar population size of around 55 million to South Africa. And it's interesting, over the 10 years of talking about this, advertising it, growing it, they've managed to go from receiving about 1 call a month to about 3 or 4 calls a day. And we've started this initiative in May of last year, and we're still sitting at around about the 1 or 2 calls a month. But really the aim of this project is to, through supporting people with just the care of angioedema, the common condition, our hope is that through these discussions, we will be able to find these cases of rare genetic forms of angioedema. And just to say that we still have provinces, although it's an autosomal dominant condition, we have provinces in South Africa where we have no cases at all. And yet we have other provinces with lots of cases. And so we expect that there's large groups of people that are missed in terms of the diagnosis. And then the other thing, and I've seen this being talked about in the last speaker, is the concept of virtual centers of excellence. And so we also, again, with the support of the patient organization, are in the process of launching this virtual angioedema center, where it's got end-to-end encryption to allow for kind of telemedicine consults with both doctors and with patients or families. And essentially it just works through an ordinary booking system and helps work with this. We're able to put information about the disease and about trials, etc., that are coming. And we hope that this will allow not just access for our patients in South Africa, but hopefully this will also allow access to other groups around the continent that have the same problem in terms of unrecognized and undiagnosed genetic forms of angioedema. And just to kind of end off by really saying for me that although, we are committed to do this from a clinical perspective, I don't think any of this would be possible without the links to patient organizations, and in this particular instance, patients and colleagues and friends from the HAE South Africa. Thank you very much.
Wow, Johnny, fantastic presentation and totally inspiring. Thank you so much. And I see that the name of that center is in memory of Senor Nuvo, who passed away.
Yes, correct. Yeah, we very kindly, the parents have given us permission to use the name of that center. There's 2 other virtual angioedema centers around the world that are also, they are named after both inspiring clinicians within that country or patients. Something similar. So yes, so we're very honored for that.
No, that's very touching to be able to a legacy to live on and to learn from that.
Yeah.
So we haven't got any questions specifically coming in, but I thought it was a very pertinent talk for this time of the year, especially in Johannesburg with high allergy levels and just the challenge in identifying them. And you mentioned that in some provinces you don't have any cases as yet. And is that just, the cases aren't just being diagnosed or even identified to enable a diagnosis?
No, I mean, the fortunate thing we have, unlike, the last course sort of presentation where some of rare diseases have very complex diagnostic testing requirements, the screening test, you can use a simple screening test of complement, which is a C4 level, which is actually fairly available through both the state and the private sector within South Africa. That has got what's called a very good negative predictive value. In other words, if you're having a swelling and that result is normal, you can pretty much exclude one of these genetic forms of angioedema. So that's very useful, and that's actually a major focus of our sort of awareness efforts and educational efforts for doctors. But on the other side of that, we because of the genetics of this condition being autosomal dominant, we are sure, and there is a de novo mutational rate, we are pretty sure that there should be cases in every province. We've got cases in all ethnicities that we see in the country. And so we think that largely those cases are missed. And like I said, it's only really if you have the unfortunate incidence of having a laryngeal swelling that you might die of the condition, but you actually, and in fact, we see this when we pick up a family, we often find 1 or 2 members of the family that have it, that actually get mild swellings, because that's the other aspect of it. There's obviously modifiers of the gene expression. And so you can actually have the same gene mutation, and yet you can have different manifestations. Some people can go their whole life and get 1 attack, and other people have attack every week. So that's also one of the challenges. But really, this to me, the key is that we have to kind of keep plugging away at awareness, because it's about sort of, and in many instances, if you take the history from these patients, they would have gone to an emergency room for like 5 or 6 years and every time they go there, they get another doctor, they get treated for allergy. They actually will have been representing, which is part of the reason why we're hoping that the angioedema hotline will kind of help us to pick these cases. And if you use the French experience, which we're really modeling on it, they have found that it's made a massive difference in finding new cases across the country.
And I'm sure it would have huge implications in terms of costs, with the having to represent, to a new clinician at an emergency. So yeah, I can totally see that. And with regards to the money, which really seems to, the money does do the talking. Did you see a real turnaround in terms of, was that a crucial point in the journey for this condition in terms of making things happen once that data had been presented and shown that it was more cost effective to be, preventative or prophylactic rather than, presenting in an emergency situation?
Yeah, I mean, the funny part about it is that, obviously we still, as you say, money still talks. And although in many conditions there is lots of data about sort of indirect costs to patients, it's still the kind of payer that is bearing the cost. And so what we wanted to do in that analysis is really just show direct hospital or healthcare related costs. And there's no question that when we showed that, the willingness to consider these targeted therapies, and in fact, we subsequently audited that. So we now show that we now access these medicines, and we've treated 100 attacks subsequent to that paper, and like 1 or 2 of them have ended up in the hospital. The rest of them have been able to largely be treated, either come in and get an infusion for the IV treatment, or now with the subcutaneous treatment we have to be giving it at home. Mm-hmm. So that really did make a difference. I definitely think so.
Okay, that's brilliant, and perhaps it could be used as a model going forward for other scenarios in healthcare as well.
Yeah, correct. And I think maybe just costing, the complete cost to the healthcare system and actually showing that in a local manner, I think is very important. I mean, we also heard about the relative cost of diagnosis versus treatment. I think that's also something that exactly right. Like if you just put that pipeline together and show, actually you calculate this cost. This is what the hospital system is paying. This is what the medical aids are actually funding. And if you can change that, whether it's a diagnosis or a treatment, or that can actually really, I think, make a difference in trying to shift the conversation or change people's attitudes towards things.
And of course, we just can't forget the societal costs in terms of what are the costs, in terms of time taken away from work, travel, accommodation, and that has a socioeconomic impact as well. And I think that's an important issue that we need to consider going forward. While the immediate direct costs do have, are important immediately, when you look at the collective societal costs, we have to see how that impacts further on the economy.
Totally, I couldn't agree more. And I think you're 100% right. But I do think, and I've had conversations, with people, for instance, on the EDL list or something. There's quite a long route there to go in terms of really changing the way that funders or policymakers are accepting those kind of more indirect societal costs. Because, for instance, I also work with a lot with other inborn errors of immunity. So rare cases of primary immunodeficiencies that require antibody supplementation. That's another good example where we've really battled. And, I had an interesting conversation, in fact, a patient that landed up in the paper in the Eastern Cape, where there's lots and lots and lots of data to show that if you give somebody with antibody deficiency, antibody replacement, they do fantastically. They stay out of hospital. They have a good quality of life. I mean, it's well established. And yet, what's interesting is when that patient was not able to access antibody replacement through the state sector in the Eastern Cape, and the feedback was not that they were in disagreement, was just that the budget that was given to pay for medications in the Eastern Cape would take simply the total amount would be too much of a chunk of the budget that would be now taking away medicines from other people. So that's the tricky part, that's where it gets really frustrating, because there you've got all the evidence, you don't need more evidence to show the cost effectiveness of it and even the direct cost. And yet there's also these silos within the health system in terms of funding. And I think that, part of what we're talking about today is moving towards NHI. And I think that some of those issues will be addressed with that kind of approach, where there would be more sort of a holistic view at the healthcare costing. And I think some of those conversations might go away when you then, and actually that will improve the ability for us to care and to treat or diagnose patients with rare diseases.
So we just need to get our ducks in a row. But thank you very much for your the extensive discussion now, and I do hope you're able to stay online for our discussion after this final presentation. So thank you very much, and just if everybody can still keep posting their questions either in the chat or preferably in the Q&A, so you can take a look there, all of the presenters, to see if there's anything live. And without further ado, I'd like to move on to our final speaker, last but not least, by a long shot. So Marco Zampoli is an associate professor of pediatrics at the Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital in the UCT. And he is head of the pediatric cystic fibrosis clinic there and leads an emerging research group that's investigating various different aspects of cystic fibrosis in South Africa and further afield in Africa. And he has established the South African Cystic Fibrosis Registry in 2018, and his current research interests include investigating the utility of conventional and beta adrenergic sweat tests for diagnosis of CF and CF-related disorders. So thanks, Marco. Looking forward to hearing more about how care for cystic fibrosis can be improved in South Africa. Over to you.
So thank you for the invitation and for the spurring this in this initiative, which I think is so important. My brief today, as I hope I would perhaps share a little bit of my personal journey and where we are with one of the rare diseases, cystic fibrosis. And if you will recall back on the previous speaker's world, I think it was Notandu's slide, cystic fibrosis was one of the more common rare diseases worldwide, including here. And so my journey with this as a lung specialist is naturally stems from that. Right. So what is cystic fibrosis? Just for the audience to remind everyone, this is a genetic disease. It's autosomal recessive. And the incidence worldwide varies quite a lot depending on various ancestries and genetic background. But in South Africa, it also varies a lot between your ethnicity. So gene is carried is quite common, about 1 in 27 white people, 1 in 60 mixed race, and estimated about 1 in 90 Black South Africans. So these are people who are carriers. So it's not an uncommon gene in the population. And so but by those calculations, we estimate the incidence is about 1 in 3,000 to 20,000 live births, depending on the genetic background. It's a multi-system disease. It affects all organs of the body, but predominantly the lungs, gastrointestinal tract, the liver, and reproductive organs, as well as others. And it really is a progressive disease, which results in ultimately in severely damaged lungs, as you can see here in the CT scan, due to repeated infections and malnutrition. And the median survival in SA is estimated, we don't have clear data, but it's estimated to be about 20 to 30 years. Internationally, however, that figure is now approaching 50 years. So with the outcome of South Africans is falling far behind what international standards. However, CF has been quite well recognized in South Africa for a long time. And I just want to also reiterate the great support from the patient lay organization, the CF Association, which has really been very active behind the scenes in supporting clinicians, in advocacy and awareness, everything in that we were speaking about, and I think just credit to them, for which a lot of my work would not have been possible. And what we have managed to achieve, and I think has been a major in the last few years, has been establishing a national registry, which crosses both public and private sectors in all the university hospitals, and there are about 10 private practices that see a fair bulk of patients with CF. The registry is really designed, it's owned by both the CF Association, the patients, as well as the university, which hosts the database at UCT, happens to be UCT where I work. And it has a certain governance structure with it, which was set up in line with registry-based information, which includes requirement for informed consent for data to be collected. One of the challenges, there's been talk about setting up a registry and for many years, but it's never got off the ground, partly because there was a hope, a false hope, I think, reliance on busy clinicians to capture data and enter data in their own time. And as a word of advice to other organizations, this is really not a wise way to approach to doing this, and simply because I think clinicians are simply too busy, and if there's not a vested interest, it will never happen. So what we managed to do is through some funding, we managed to appoint full part-time data collectors, and whose sole job is to visit various practices and clinics and to extract the relevant information from the medical records and capture it. And this has been proven to be quite a successful model for our purposes. And it's a once-a-year update, so it's not very intensive, and the same information, and it gives you sort of, and it's a fairly simple data collection process. And it's really been proven a valuable resource for both data research as well as advocacy. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So this is some of the outputs from the registry. We've managed to successfully publish two registry reports, which is our goal is to publish these once a year in line with international registries. And here you can just see a summary, a page of the kind of information that we've been able to gather, where the patients are being treated, the ages, how many have been captured. So you can see from here, this was the latest report at the end of last year, 525, majority slightly more adult children than adults, which is reverse of what we see internationally. And you can see it's split by about 60% having some form of private medical aid versus 40% who are totally dependent on the state. So this has been useful information to give you to see the landscape of CF and where the patients are and what form of treatment they can access. And so this is just a summary page that we collect a lot more detail, and you can see just an illustration of the information that we've had gathered. And this has been very valuable for us in terms of negotiating with pharma, in terms of accessing treatments, because as you will hear, that there are very specific genetic targeted treatments now in the pipeline. And so knowing what the genetics and genotype of the South African population has and how many there are we wouldn't be able to even initiate discussions without this kind of information. So what about the diagnosis of CF in South Africa? Well, there are various modalities. The first line is a sweat test, which measures how much salt is in the sweat. It does require special equipment and expertise. It's generally most available in most major centers, both in private and public, but there are some provinces like Limpopo and Mpumalanga, Free State, Northern Cape, where it's simply not available and patients have to travel. And this certainly will contribute to delayed diagnosis in many settings. The genetic aspects, of course, is available in South Africa and has been for some time, but really only for the common gene. And that's about 50 genes we can test. However, the genetics of CF is much more complicated. There are about 400 different genes identified, and the number is growing. And we simply do not have access to that in South Africa, at least certainly not in the public sector. In the private, it's very expensive, and again, it's often out of pocket. Patients have to pay. And it's very important to get complete genotyping, as I've said, because this really is the basis for new treatments that are in the pipeline. And having full genotyping is actually essential now. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. However, worldwide, most people in developing countries, the majority of babies, children are now being diagnosed by newborn screening for CF. And CF is one of the leading conditions that has been detected by newborn screening. And for example, from the European registry, about 80% of all new diagnoses are detected by newborn screening. In Brazil, a country which has a similar profile to South Africa, has implemented newborn screening, and even they in the last 10 years have managed to achieve a 60% diagnosis rate by newborn screening, which is quite a remarkable achievement. So newborn screening is, in my view, the next frontier for CF diagnosis, especially and specifically for South Africa. And as we probably know, there is no universal newborn screening program in South Africa except for the private sector on a fee, and that really isn't a model for effective newborn screening programs. It needs to be universal and free. And this is just a global map. You can see countries where CF newborn screening is happening, and as you can see there, it's, of course, North America, Europe, Australasia, and a few South American countries. And the benefits of newborn screening, as I think it applies to not only CF, but a lot of other genetic diseases, is early diagnosis, without a doubt, improves outcomes. And ultimately, the cost of treatment, long-term treatment, it prevents early onset complications, and therefore improves quality of life as well as cost of treatment. However, it does require substantial public health investment and infrastructure, which South Africa currently does not have. And it does require that you have established centers of excellence, because screening and detecting cases need to be referred on to a center where further investigations and treatment can be initiated. And of course, it must be universal and free. The other, I think, quite a major achievement in the CF world, South African community, is we've established a medical and scientific advisory committee. Was established many years ago, something which I inherited from my predecessors, and this has worked very well. It got representation from the lay community as well as clinicians with a special interest in CF. And through this scientific advisory committee, we managed to publish comprehensive guidelines of all aspects of CF care, which I think are quite widely used both for medical aids and state. It really is local experts reviewing international literature, and we've obviously, and where necessary, adapted for local circumstances. It's a consensus opinion, and it really has been quite active engagement with the CF community. Now, once you've made the diagnosis, the journey just begins, because CF care and treatment is very complicated and costly. There's as yet no cure, but I foresee CF will be one of the genetic diseases, my prediction, for which there will one day, the first to be, for which there will be a cure, just that because of so much investment at a global, international stage is taking place in CF, that is, and the advances being made in the last 10 years has just been remarkable. However, public, for example, the billing, that's costly treatment. And for example, in the public sector, when children reach the age of 6, they get billed according to the means test, and the expenses, if you're not on a free classification, are just simply prohibitive and not expensive. And it's not only, it's one of the things that, there's been a lot of talk about how the medical aids and their fee billing structures are problematic, but the public health system as well does not address the cost of medication, specifically for people with sort of low middle income who are not completely destitute, who are required to pay in something. Late diagnosis and aging increases with cost. So as people get older, they get more complication, the costs increase, and you do require intensive monitoring with health checks by specialists. CF is unfortunately one of those conditions that is not PMB, which has been a source of much frustration for many patients in the private sector, and we continue to battle on that ground. And really, outcomes is really closely linked to what treatment you can access and affordability of healthcare and your social economic circumstances. And sadly, South Africans are not benefiting from all these advances internationally in the CF care simply because we can't afford it. And so they're going back to the registry. Advocacy and activism of the CF community using the registry data has been really invaluable in making us being noticed. And South Africans' voices in this global activism is very loud and clear, and I think it's something to be proud of. So referring, what are these new treatments? The so-called CFTR modulators, which was FDA approved in 2019 for the most common CF gene, the DEL508 mutation, which is the majority. And in South Africa, that means 85% of South Africans on our registry would be eligible for this new treatment from there. And currently it's licensed from the age of 6. So it's really has been a miraculous treatment. If ever there was a miracle treatment, this is one. It's completely changed the landscape and the outlook for people with CF. It's been a complete game changer. And and it's become the standard of care in most of the wealthy north. But these drugs are not registered in South Africa. There's only one international company that holds the patent, lodged a patent in South Africa, and they won't and can't register it in South Africa. And there seems to be not much interest in doing it because there's no commercial value in the small, relatively small South African CF community. There's no single drug access regulatory body, so the provider, even if one of the challenges the pharmaceutical company has is who do they negotiate a price with? There are so many there are so many providers with different costing in South Africa providing healthcare. The cost is exorbitant to $300,000 per year per patient, and this is lifelong treatment. It's not a single treatment. So it will bankrupt any kind of medical aid or health system. And the really frustrating thing is there is a generic option available from Argentina, but we can't import it due to all sorts of risks of patent infringement practices. And we have very fragmented healthcare systems, private and public, and there's no single provider to negotiate these drug access prices. So the work that this group, looking what Kelly has discussed, is I think in this is a very good example of where having a single negotiated and single funding body would be very valuable for accessing new treatments. So there is this big move, both legal and other, to try and push for the issuing of voluntary license of the generic products. And unfortunately, it takes a very costly legal and court process to pursue this path. But we shall see. This is still a work in progress. So if we look at CF in South Africa, what have been our successes and failures? So certainly from our failures is we have very fragmented health services between provinces and public versus private, and even between provinces. The public health fund is very under-resourced. Private healthcare is completely unregulated. Patients can go and see who they want. They've got there's no incentive for them to seek out patient centers of excellence, and so there's no regulation in terms of the kind of treatment they should be getting. Advanced genetic diagnosis of services are not available in the public sector, and we have very restricted access to essential treatment in the public sector and many private sectors due to non-PMB status. And as we all know, the Department of Health at the moment does not prioritize rare disease. However, we have had some successes, as we have a very strong community participation with activism, which is one of the main drivers behind what we managed to achieve. There are established centers of excellence and expertise in some provinces, both in the public and private sector. And I think but it's hanging on to those resources is proving to become increasingly challenging We do have consensus guidelines written by local experts and have been really updated. We can get a rapid diagnosis in most settings, but not all. And I think that could still is some room for improvement. The CF registry has been a great success, and I think is ongoing project, which I think has elevated the profile of CF both nationally and internationally in South Africa. And through this process, we've been able to start engaging with pharma and with ongoing access to the new drugs, which are still not available to South Africans. So lastly, I'd like to share that I had worked in a very fortunate privilege to work in an environment where we have an established center of care, a rare disease team. This is in a public sector hospital, and we have a dedicated team of all from various other sources, various disciplines, who I think have been a great support to me, to our patients and families, in both the public and private sector. And I think as an example where center, in terms of the NHI's model as well, you can establish centers of excellence for both private and public sectors. And I think the example that we have is a good one to illustrate this point. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions, and I hope that has shed some light on given some hope for other rare diseases, and that it's you can do things provided there's passion and will. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Marco. And I think just the passion, as has come through both in your presentation and also for the previous two speakers, Johnny and Chris especially, just the passion that you have for your area, and I think it just comes through so clearly. So thank you for that. There's no specific questions come through. There has been a comment from Kelly saying it's just so lovely to see a multidisciplinary team in place, and the public sector is really leading the way in this regard, which is clear from your photo and from what you've mentioned. I have a very quick question for you myself before we go into the wider discussion with the rest of the speakers. With regard to the CF registry, you've got data collectors that are basically dedicated data collectors that do the actual data collection to understandably take that burden off of the clinicians, which is the reason why so many registries fail, because there just isn't capacity, and the clinicians can't do that on their normal everyday tasks, which we completely on the same page as. The approach that we've taken for our rare disease registry, as Kelly outlined at the beginning, is a patient-initiated database registry. So the patient takes the initiative, so to speak, and this is happening in a number of other global registries as well. And then that data can then be validated at a later stage. Would you see that as something that could be perhaps incorporated into your model? I mean, because obviously you've got to ensure sustainability in terms of having those data collectors available and capacitated and paid and so on. What's your thinking around that?
Yes, I am aware, and there's a lot of internationally as well, and move to have patient-driven registries. I think it's definitely an option, and for some in some circumstances. My personal hesitation with that is I think it will give a very biased. I'm not sure how representative that would be of everyone affected by the condition. My experience is the very committed and driven families and patients will participate in such an initiative and will actively participate. And so you tend to get a more skewed, if you rely entirely on patient-driven things, you'll only get quite a skewed picture. Because, for example, if you use CF, I'm just using CF as an example, a lot of our patients come from a lot of our patients have very dysfunctional home circumstances, very difficult, challenging, and to ask, relying on them, if you are to capture the information, they won't due to other priorities in their life, And so you're going to miss out, you're going to lose out on that important information as well. So I think it's certainly for those who are interested, yes, but I don't think it should be the only way, because I do think it will give you a skewed a picture of the
Great.
situation.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So we're going to, if I can just ask all the speakers just to go back onto video, please. And thank you very much, Marco. Please stay, stay on video, and there may be more questions coming your way. So thank you all the speakers for coming back on board. We've got about 10 minutes now for Q&A. And I'd just like to open the floor. And while we just wait for those to come through, there is a question. There's a couple of questions actually that have come through. This one is for you, Marco. It's asking, in the absence of sweat test analysis, how will you advise clinicians in Limpopo working up patients for CF? There may be reliance on fecal elastase and genotyping, which most of the time comes back as negative for the 50 tested mutations. If you could quickly answer that. And then there is another long-standing question that's been online from Riona, who's asking about a national risk equalization fund. Could it be a viable solution where all stakeholders contribute financially? Which is quite an interesting approach. So if I can go to you first, Marco, and then open the floor for Riona's question, please.
Sure. I think that's a valid question, and that is the challenge with some of our underserviced, less serviced provinces. However, I think we've got fairly good genetic diagnostic capacity, even in the public sector. And, sending a blood test off is quite simple. And I disagree. I think if the pickup rate in our South Africa, even with what we have, you're going to pick up at least 50% of the patients. So I think it's still worth doing that. But unfortunately, for now, if there's still a strong suspicion, it requires physical referral to a center that can do a sweat test. And so and I think, establishing diagnostic centers, a specialized test like a sweat test in a province like Limpopo, where you need to be doing many tests, you need enough tests a week to become proficient and expert at it. So it doesn't make sense it's better to develop a few centers and to do the test and to do it well, rather than setting up multiple sites where the tests are not done or done poorly. And I think it is a reality we deal with in South Africa. And I think, in my view, and I think this applies to across the board, across all rare diseases, establishing a few centers of excellence is much better than everyone trying to do their own. And I think there needs to be an understanding across provinces, health departments, medical aids as well, that to accept this and encourage referral pathways to centers of excellence, both for diagnosis as well as for treatment.
That's a great point. Thanks so much. I think we're going to come back to the Centers of Excellence discussion. I just want to put out to all of the panelists, and I'm wondering if Kelly would be the right person for this to answer that question about a national risk equalization fund.
I think actually I would like to hear from Gavin and Nolu on what they think that the prospects would be. I think certainly from our experience, our discussions with many of the medical schemes up until this point, and as well as the Department of Health, there has definitively been some form of an interest with regards to a risk equalization. I think a few years ago, some of the issues around that was that there wasn't a defined diagnosis. A defined definition. So it was a gray area in terms of what would and wouldn't be included. And then there's always been a discussion around, what exactly does that fund need to fund? Does it need to fund the diagnostics? Does it need to fund the supportive care that might be required? Or is it mainly only for commercial therapeutics? So I think if we had some clarity around that, it would be a good starting point. But I'd be really interested to hear from industry's perspective, as well as from Nolu's perspective, what the prospects on a risk equalization could be. So maybe if I can hand it over to Nolu first and then Gavin.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Interestingly enough, I mean, a few years ago, I remember putting a proposal together on behalf of Discovery on a rare disease fund, and it was really addressing exactly that. And it was not even risk equalization fund for, I mean, if you think about it in the context of medical schemes in the private sector, it was really a rare disease fund that cuts across both private and public. And then I think for us, we really think it's something that should be considered in future, because it allows proper access. And I mean, we had thought through what that would look like in terms of how you structure it, the entry criteria to funding, how you set it up. It's really just maybe getting the willingness to set something like that up, because it does create maybe better access. It also, when we speak about centralized procurement, it's an easier process to use that fund to procure. And I think you can't restrict it only to treatment. It must be, holistic, and think about the diagnostic component of rare diseases. So I think it's a concept that we've thought about. We've discussed it, at various platforms that we've had, but I don't think it's something that we have managed to get it to that implementation level. So it's something that, we need to pick it up and see how we can make it work. And I think, Kelly, we've done, significant work since that time to say, now we've got the framework, we've got some other aspects that could make that decision and discussion much, much, much easier maybe now to have. Gavin?
Yeah, I look at it from a social solidarity point of view, where the young subsidize the old, and the healthy subsidize the unhealthy. So should a REF mechanism be the right mechanism in the private sector for rare diseases? Yes, it is, because if Discovery picks up 60% of the rare disease costs for the private sector, is that fair or not? It's probably not fair. So you do need a risk adjusted mechanism between medical aids. But my question would be, a fund would work when there is certainty and predictability around patient access and reimbursement, because there's no point in having a fund but we then don't know what are we going to fund. So I think if you had a fund, guidelines must be in place, COEs must be in place, clinical entry criteria must be clear. What diseases are you going to fund? What diagnostics are you going to fund? So I think the two are part of the same answer. Should we have a REF between schemes in the private sector for rare diseases? Probably yes. But even if you did have one, there are other things that need to be resolved to make it really impactful. So I would support the idea, understanding the policy dynamic we're at in the moment, but conceptually is the right thing to do, yes.
Do we feel that we're at a place where we could maybe pilot specifically around a few particular conditions? Would that be a good implementation process? I'm trying to think, how do we kind of move forward? Like, where's the starting point? Would to limit it to certain diseases be a good opportunity to then see if that's that's workable?
I think the first step, I can't talk on behalf of the schemes because they're the ultimate decision maker, but what you would need to do is to create a legal framework that allows the schemes to transfer money into a certain pool, because that framework doesn't exist at the moment. So to me, it's actually a legal question more than anything else.
Yeah, no, I agree, Kevin. I think there are a few steps before getting to the pilot. Even who's contributing, how much are they contributing? And also, how do you choose which conditions? How do you prioritize which conditions? Because obviously, if you go, without any criteria in terms of inclusion of conditions, then it creates problems. So there is a bit of work that would be required before we can get to a point where we can implement something like that. But I think, like Gavin says, that's the desire. But there are a few steps that need to be fulfilled before we can really get to that point. And I think it's about pushing for those steps to happen before we can then realize that. It could be the goal for us to work towards that.
That's what I'm hearing too. I'm definitely hearing that we need to have a follow-up meeting specifically starting to address these issues and obviously look at the legalities around it and see what is possible and what needs to change in order to make it possible. So thanks very, very much for that. Helen?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Gavin and Nolu. I think that's a lot of food for thought.
I see Johnny's hands come up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Johnny.
No, I guess my question was related to that, and maybe Gavin can answer this question. But one of the things that I always wonder about is that, with many rare diseases, the diagnosis, as Marco was saying, is becoming, specialized in a few centers. So if you have, you've got a phenotype that you expect a unusual autoinflammation disease, you'll contact the NIH or one of the colleagues there, right? And you might. And I recently had a patient that was even able to travel there, and they had a comprehensive set of review. Now, one of the things that I'm in relationship to that, I wonder if why is pharma, or what are the barriers to why pharma is not sort of pursuing a kind of a way of tiered pricing for therapeutics access in different countries that doesn't necessarily have to involve the rigorous process of like a dossier registration. I mean, because you might have many conditions where there are 2 or 3 cases in a particular country. In which case, like the easiest thing would be if there was some kind of a framework that says, okay, well, we've got this drug, and there's a sort of tier based on, I don't know, some kind of algorithm of GDP per capita and patient individual resources or health system that could allow pharma to take that therapy and match it to the patient without having to go through a long process for every single drug or even register in that country at all. Some kind of almost like a supranational concept for rare diseases. I don't know. That's just what I have thought about.
Yeah. So I mean, just 2 comments quickly. One is, individual pharma companies have different ways of looking at different countries from a pricing point of view. So those are individual company decisions. The second thing is the International Medicines Patent Pool allows certain countries to access certain medicines if the company agrees to put that molecule into the medicines patent pool. The third thing is South Africa is an anomaly from an international pharma point of view, because you've got this dynamic between public and private. The pharma companies may view South Africa in a private sector lens, which means it's excluded from a tiered pricing, or it may view it in an emerging developing economy lens that says they have a different pricing strategy. What's unfortunate is each company makes its own decision. So there's no sort of harmonization of an approach to a certain market that allows access to be accelerated, particularly for rare diseases. So it's kind of a complex question, Johnny. But I don't see a coordinated pharma approach for South Africa, because each company makes determinations on the South African market on their own. So that's probably the shortest answer I can give you, Johnny, which is probably not helpful, but that's just my perspective.
And what about organizations like you showed that slide on EPASA, like these, in the same way that Rare Diseases International is like a international representative of all these regional and subsequent organizations, like, in a way to maybe, and as you mentioned in the previous answer, some of this is like a legal thing, is there a way that like this kind of group of body of pharma can negotiate with RDAI International, and with that actually challenge this kind of thing where, patents for certain molecules in one place because otherwise, if you've got, because I can totally understand as well, like if you're a pharma company, you've got 4 patients in a country and that's all you're going to get. Why would you, ever bother to go through all the rigmarole to get treatments? Whereas like, if there was some kind of a supranational structure, like that's why I use the example of diagnosis, is because that seems to be heading that route. Like you don't have to diagnose every condition in every country.
So like South Africa's got a great track record of allowing patient access in ways that get around patent issues. I mean, the HIV thing was resolved by voluntary licenses being given to certain manufacturers. So that mechanism is open to individual companies to pursue, but it would require a global lobby to say, listen, there's a particular problem in a particular country, and let's use voluntary licenses to solve that problem. So I think we've got a mechanism to do it from a voluntary license point of view, which lowers the cost, which improves access. And I think that could be a potential solution if the manufacturers agree to that and there's a political will to create a market where there's a volume response, put it that way.
Thanks, Gavin. Marco, your hand is raised.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to respond to Gavin. I think there is a mechanism, and I agree with you. South Africa has a great record, but I think ultimately it rests on the individual pharma companies in how they in what decisions they make, and it's entirely in their hands. And it's and this is really what we in the CF world, what we face at the moment, is with a pharma company who's really not at all budging or interested, and we've got no there's very little one can do except challenges in court, and so I'm not sure how one compels pharmaceutical companies to respond ethically and be responsive to the needs of certain countries.
Yeah, I mean, if coming back to Nolo's thing about, and it was echoed in terms of, if there was a central procurer where there's certainty of market access with a volume response, that is crystal clear that we've got 100 patients. If we negotiate and allow access for 100 patients, they will be treated in the same level regardless of province or sector. That solves the problem because there's certainty and predictability. A pharma company at the moment cannot make that volume decision because there's no single purchaser or volume response that's guaranteed or certain. Now that sounds a bit hard because it's not a patient perspective, but in a global pharmaceutical market, those are the decision criteria you would need to have to create certainty and predictability. So the ideal state would be if we had an NHI, a central procurer, the volumes are certain and they will be procured. Then it's easy to make the decision. But in a fragmented environment like we're in, it's very difficult to make that decision on the patient's behalf.
I think if I can, sorry, Helen, if I can just add, I think, from a rare disease international perspective, I think some good work is being done there with the international collaborations in terms of the one is the World Health Organization's essential medicines list and the inclusion of some rare disease products on that list. I think that would provide the certainty that Gavin's perspective's kind of looking for, in the sense that it would be ratified that those conditions should be covered in each country that's affiliated to the World Health Organization. It's not a complete solution, but it's certainly a starting point. And then I think that there is also a lot of work being done through the RDAI, which is the International Rare Disease Research Coalition Consortia. And I think that there's some working streams there as well that are working on this kind of pricing and regulation and kind of doing what Marco and Johnny are both suggesting in terms of trying to create some form of regulatory framework. So there is definitely a move towards that from an international perspective. I just think it's still relatively early days. So I think we will be in for some interesting discussion going forward in that regard, and hopefully some solutions come about.
Thanks, Kelly. I see that we're actually overrun on time. We're 7 minutes past 1 currently. But just to enable us to wrap up, if I can just ask each of the panelists just to quickly give a very quick one-sentence sum up of what the takeaway message is for today and how we can really take this forward for implementation. I'll start with Johnny.
I think for me, the key things, and this is, in line with the questions I just had, the key is the strength in coming together, right? So rare diseases are individually rare and collectively increasingly common. And I think that's a narrative is very important. And then my own experience, I would say that absolutely, whether it's diagnosis, treatment, or even just access to care, those are something that, patients and organizing patients together is really critical. And so that's been my experience so far, and I think ongoingly for rare diseases. So, to have patient and kind of clinician champions, that's what we need.
Great. Thanks, Johnny.
Thanks for including me.
Chris?
Yeah, I think I've already said it. We need an advisory board that can drive some of the initiatives and ideas that we spoke about here this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That's definitely something that we want to take forward. If we could move to, so I'm just seeing who's still here. Gavin.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm very encouraged because we're on a journey. We're making progress, and I think the collaboration is increasing across all the stakeholders. For me, it's what practical things can we do in the next 12 months until we have the next forum. I think there are things we can do, and I think we're making progress. So I echo the sentiments around collaboration, stakeholder involvement, because there's a patient at the end of all of this. So I'm encouraged. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Gavin. Nolu?
Thank you so much, Helen. I think the issues that we're facing are not unique to South Africa. I think the rare disease issues are really a global issue. But I think for me, what really is comforting is that, like Gavin is saying, we are finding each other in the conversations. And I think there is hope that we can actually make something very meaningful out of the collaborations. And no one party, no one stakeholder can do this alone. So we need each other because collectively we can make a difference.
Great, thank you. Very wise words there. Marco, and then Kelly.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, on top of what everyone has said, I think the lack of a single negotiating drug access body is, I think, a major barrier. There's no point in diagnosing rare conditions if we can't access treatment. And I think not accessing treatments in the complicated South African landscape is a major barrier. And I think I would love to see that private insurers, pharma, engage with the government to make that a reality to the benefit of everyone.
Great. Thank you, Marco. Kelly?
Yeah, firstly, just to say that I too am encouraged. I think it's really, really nice that we all are able to have these discussions, respect everyone's views and opinions, and still collectively, try work towards a common goal. Collaboration is certainly key. Commitment is, we've got the ideas, but we also need to commit to executing them. And I think that we definitely are in a time of change in that regard. And I think that there is a willingness and a commitment across the board. So I'm really, really looking forward to it. As Gavin says, we need to try develop an action plan that we can implement so that when we meet again next year at this time, we can show, that the building blocks are in place and that we have managed to execute. But lastly, just to say that it has been a really, really tough year in terms of the stakeholder engagement, where we have had to really have some very hard conversations. And it really just is encouraging for me that we can come back and still work together even after those brutal conversations have had to be had. And just looking forward to the progress that we are certainly going to make going forward.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for all the participants for joining online. And thank you to all of the speakers for making the time available to both prepare and to stay on for discussions as well as giving your presentations. And I think going forward, I think we're in a very good position in terms of the conversation, and we just need to keep that conversation going and to take it forward to those action points. And I think we're in a better place than we were last year, and I believe that next year we'll be even in a better position to go forward. So look out to your emails for the report coming out of this meeting and picking up those action points, including the advisory board and the centers of excellence and so on. So thank you once again. Apologies for running over. Obviously, we'll need to make it a longer event next year. Thanks to everybody. Have a great rest of the day.